from Corsica to the fourth Rome. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 101, Duke of Choiseul. Crown. Count Marbeuf stood up in surprise and even accidentally knocked over a small round table beside him. Sorry, I was rude. Count Marbeuf quickly took out a towel to wipe the tea that splashed on his body, bowed his head to apologize to Lawrence, sat back in his seat, and said with a silly smile, "Haha, I didn't know you were a jeweler. You want to make a crown for King Louis?" Lawrence looked at Count Marbeuf, not believing that he didn't understand what he meant, so he said directly, "This crown was not made by me, but by God. This crown is 360 miles long and 140 miles wide. Its name is Corsica." After Lawrence's calm words fell, Count Marbeuf covered his forehead and was stunned for a long time, then picked up the letter on the table, did not open it, but looked at it for a long time. He originally thought that Lawrence was just a temporary traveler, but Count Marbeuf would never have thought that this young man, who was only 20 years old, had already reached the position of dominating the fate of a country. Corsica. It seems that a lot of things have happened. Are you sure? Count Marbeuf gently put the envelope back on the table and whispered to Lawrence. Lawrence shook his head calmly and replied, "I just hope to deliver the letter in your name. If it goes well, you will certainly make a lot of money as an introducer. Even if King Louis is not interested in this, he will not blame you for worrying about state affairs." Count Marbeuf nodded and admitted that Lawrence was right. He was just a messenger and did not need to be responsible for this matter. He had no reason to refuse this request. Moreover, Count Marbeuf himself knew that, if an agreement was finally reached on this matter, Lawrence might even become the actual ruler of Corsica at that time. Using such a small effort to exchange for a favor from such a young man with unlimited potential is a good deal, no matter how you look at it. I understand. I will write a statement immediately and then present the letter directly to the court in my name. Count Marbeuf put the envelope in his pocket with a solemn expression, staring at Lawrence, and said in a deep voice, March 22nd, 1770. It was the 10th day that Lawrence stayed at Count Marbeuf's manor. In order to get the news of Ajaccio as soon as possible, Lawrence did not let Count Marbeuf take him to Versailles, but directly sent the letter to the palace of Versailles together with the Count's statement. Although this was somewhat against etiquette, Lawrence believed that in the face of such a major matter, Louis XV would not care about such details. In the morning, as usual, Lawrence got up and went directly to the dining table to have breakfast with Count Marbeuf. However, what surprised Lawrence was that when he came to the table, there was a half-eaten piece of white bread and a warm cream stew on Count Marbeuf's seat, but he was nowhere to be seen. For a traditional noble like him, it was very rude to leave in the middle of a meal, unless there was something really important. Just when Lawrence was a little confused, the manor steward hurriedly walked into the restaurant, bowed to Lawrence and said, "Dear sir, my master has gone to greet a guest. He asked you to change into formal clothes after breakfast." A guest? Lawrence's eyes lit up. Calculating the time, it was almost time for the special envoy sent by Louis XV to arrive, and the one who made Count Marbeuf so anxious to greet him must be the king's envoy. "Do you know who the guest is?" Lawrence asked casually. The manor housekeeper nodded. "When these people of status visit others, they will send servants to inform the host in advance." Then he said, "It is Lord Etienne Francois. Of course, he is best known as the Duke of Choiseul." Duke of Choiseul? Lawrence was stunned for a moment, frowned and looked at the manor housekeeper, and confirmed the identity of the visitor with him again. If this envoy is really that big shot, it makes Lawrence feel a little tricky. After getting a positive answer, Lawrence frowned even more tightly, and whispered softly, "Should I say this is a good thing or a bad thing?" The Duke of Choiseul was a powerful figure in the Louis XV period. He had made outstanding military achievements in the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, and made considerable reforms to the French military system. In 1770, his position should be the French Minister of War, but the Minister of Foreign Affairs at this time is also his cousin, so he still controls France's foreign policy. In addition, many historical books have recorded that the Duke of Choiseul could influence, even dominate, and intimidate Louis XV's behavior to a certain extent. Although he was dismissed from his post by Louis XV, who could no longer bear it in the autumn of 1770, he was definitely one of the most important figures in French politics at the moment. Lawrence couldn't help but sigh as soon as he sat down at the table. He immediately lost his appetite and went back to his room to change into formal clothes. A perfect version of the book in 1609. The arrival of the Duke of Choiseul also made Lawrence happy and worried. On the one hand, it meant that King Louis, or the Duke himself, attached great importance to the content mentioned in Lawrence's letter. But on the other hand, in front of such a strong figure, Lawrence might find it difficult to gain any advantage in the subsequent negotiations. About half an hour later, Lawrence, dressed in a gorgeous outfit, stood at the door of the main building of the manor, adjusting his uncomfortable scarf, while waiting for the arrival of the Duke of Choiseul. After a while, a 4-horse carriage slowly drove in on the only dirt road in front of the manor. The carriage was 7 or 8 meters long and 5 or 6 meters wide, and could accommodate more than 10 people, but there were obviously only 2 rows of seats inside. The wheels were all inlaid with brass outerings, and even the handrails outside the carriage were engraved with intricate patterns. Not to mention the 4 horses pulling the carriage in front, whose coats were all pure black, with almost no stray hairs to be seen, and the manes of these horses were carefully groomed and tied into a uniform style like knots. Following this carriage, there were 4 or 5 carriages of ordinary specifications, which seemed to be used by the Duke's personal servants. Lawrence looked from a distance, and could see Count Marbeuf riding a horse around the carriage, not sitting in the carriage. It was unknown whether he was not of high status or he voluntarily rode a horse behind. The carriage stopped steadily at the entrance of the manor, and the coachman wearing white gloves quickly jumped off the carriage, opened the door of the carriage, and then helped a middle-aged man to slowly walk out of the carriage. The Duke's eyes were very sharp. He looked around as he got off the car, but he was obviously not interested in such a countryside. He soon walked towards the main building with Count Marbeuf, who had dismounted. Lawrence stood quietly and watched the 2 people walking towards him. "Please allow me to introduce you." Count Marbeuf walked to Lawrence with Count Choiseul, coughed twice and said, "This is Napoleon Bonaparte from Corsica, the owner of the letter." Lawrence looked at Count Choiseul, bowed slightly, and said calmly, "It is my honor to meet you, Your Excellency." Count Choiseul nodded, but then stared at Lawrence meaningfully for a full minute, as if an artist was appreciating his work seriously, and then slowly said, "I have heard of you, young man." Chapter 102, A Constitutional Monarchy in Corsica, Part 1. Lawrence kept smiling without changing his expression, but he was constantly searching for information about the Duke of Choiseul. The negotiation had begun the moment the 2 met, and Lawrence represented not only Corsica, but also his personal interests. In order to get the Duke of Choiseul's concession in the following verbal battle, Lawrence had to make good use of the information gap he had. By the way, if I remember correctly, Lawrence glanced at the Duke of Choiseul and muttered in his heart, he was the leader of the negotiations for Genoa to sell Corsica to France in history. France did not get Corsica on this timeline, so did he notice me from that time? Although he had a lot of thoughts in his mind, Lawrence still chuckled twice without losing his manners, bowed again and said, "It really surprises me that you can remember my name." The Duke of Choiseul squinted and looked at Lawrence, but did not speak. I don't know if he was thinking about his words, or waiting for Lawrence to speak up. Seeing that the 2 had just exchanged a few words, Count Marbeuf coughed awkwardly twice, moved between the 2 and said, "My lord, Lawrence, let's go in and talk." After that, Count Marbeuf led the 2 into the reception room in the main building, ordered his servants to serve them desserts and tea, and then left the reception room with the others very tactfully. "Mr. Bonaparte, your letter is very interesting." Duke Choiseul took a sip of the teacup, then put it aside with a look of disgust, turned sideways and looked at Lawrence and said, "The crown of Corsica. The people on the island are probably not very willing to restore a republic to a monarchy." After hearing this, Lawrence shook his head slowly and sighed in his heart that Duke Choiseul was indeed a veteran in French politics, and he wanted to put himself at a disadvantage in the first sentence. Duke Choiseul's words were nothing more than questioning whether Lawrence had the ability to put the crown on Louis XV's head. As long as Lawrence showed any difficulty, the Duke of Choiseul would take the opportunity to say that this would allow the French side to invest resources to help Lawrence, thus forcing Lawrence to make concessions in the next negotiations. Since he had seen through the Duke of Choiseul's intention, Lawrence directly changed the subject and said, "Since I have submitted a letter to the Palace of Versailles, I'm naturally capable of doing it. But His Majesty, the king should be very satisfied with this crown, right?" As soon as the voice fell, the Duke of Choiseul could not help but look at Lawrence twice. He did not expect that such a young boy would be so good at speaking. He turned from defense to offense in one sentence and set a trap for himself. Once he admitted that Louis XV was very eager to get the crown of Corsica, the other party could seize this point in the subsequent negotiations to force him to retreat. Seeing that he did not gain an advantage in the words, the Duke of Choiseul cleared his throat and was not prepared to continue to play along with Lawrence. After all, the most important thing in negotiations is the strength of both parties. Yes, His Majesty the King is very satisfied. Duke Choiseul nodded and admitted. Lawrence also nodded. This result was also within his expectations. As for the reason, it was actually exactly the same as the reason Lawrence told Paulie when he first met him 2 years ago. Louis XV lost the 7 Years' War and handed over all of France's decades of colonial achievements, which caused his reputation to plummet. Now, if he could get a new crown, and a crown offered by the locals, it would be more satisfying for Louis XV's prestige than buying Corsica from Genoa. Lawrence smiled at Duke Choiseul. If he guessed correctly, King Louis might have given Duke Choiseul a death order before leaving, asking him to get the crown of Corsica. "Okay, young man." Duke of Choiseul glanced at Lawrence. This smile of control made Duke of Choiseul very unhappy, so he said impatiently, "Tell me, what do you want? Money or title?" Lawrence shook his head slowly and firmly, and said, "I only want Corsica." Duke of Choiseul said nothing, looked at Lawrence with some dissatisfaction, took a deep breath and said slowly, "You want autonomy?" "Yes." Lawrence nodded. "Young man." Duke Choiseul's expression was already somewhat irritated, and he suppressed his dissatisfaction and said, "You use the power of France to pacify Corsica, and then you want to give the king a hollow crown as a reward." Lawrence deliberately sighed, looking embarrassed, touching his forehead, and shaking his head, and said, "You know the situation in Corsica, and even any city in France, is richer than it. What can you expect to get from this?" Duke Choiseul listened silently. He also knew how poor Corsica was. At that time, France would not only be unlikely to collect much tax revenue, but would also have to provide large financial subsidies in return. In this sense, Corsica was a hot potato and a money-making cave. Giving the kingdom of Corsica full autonomy and letting them support themselves would save a lot of financial expenditure. In addition, Lawrence struck while the iron was hot and continued, "The customs and traditions of the Corsicans all come from Italy, which is very different from the French culture. They are definitely foreigners. If you insist on sending French officials to govern Corsica, to be honest, I'm not sure whether I can quell the endless rebellion on the island." Duke Choiseul also knew that the Corsicans were poorly educated and were often discriminated against by surrounding countries and were despised as savages and barbarians. But in contrast, the Corsicans were fierce and aggressive, and their blood was hot-blooded. If they were really subject to high-pressure rule, the people on the island would inevitably resist the French, like they resisted the Genoese. Maybe you are right, young man. A correct version of the book in 1619. Duke Choiseul closed his eyes and pondered for a long time, then shook his head and said, "But I don't see France getting the rewards it deserves." "No, France will get quite important rewards," Lawrence said with a smile. He also knew that he couldn't just put forward his own conditions. If he wanted to reach a final agreement, he had to make some concessions. "Oh, what is it?" Duke Choiseul raised his eyelids and asked with a little interest. "The French Navy's right to station in Corsica." "Right to station?" Duke Choiseul waved his hands and said indifferently, "France has no shortage of Mediterranean ports. We have Toulon and Marseille. Who cares about the small fishing port in Ajaccio? France may not care, but a certain country does." Lawrence smiled and shook his head. Duke Choiseul frowned, with a bad premonition, and asked in a deep voice, "What do you mean?" Which country? England. England? In Ajaccio. Duke Choiseul couldn't help showing a surprised look on his face. After thinking for a while, he realized that, if the Royal Navy was stationed in Ajaccio, it would pose a great threat to the French Mediterranean fleet. Wait. Not long ago, a British warship stayed in Ajaccio. It should not have left yet. Duke Choiseul's expression was uncertain, staring at Lawrence, and said seriously. Although the Duke of Choiseul knew that the Corsicans were negotiating an agreement with the British, he had not yet found out what the agreement was. Lawrence remained smiling and said briefly, I can tell you who is on that ship. Who? William Pitt. William Pitt. Damn William Pitt. When the Duke of Choiseul heard the name of this opponent who made him hate him so much during the 7 Years' War, he immediately lost his composure and couldn't help cursing. Of course, while cursing, the Duke of Choiseul also understood that a man of William Pitt's status came to Corsica to negotiate a treaty of what level? Chapter 103 A Constitutional Monarchy in Corsica, Part 2. William Pitt. Duke Choiseul took a deep breath and shook his head. He couldn't help but start to crack his joints with his hands and kept repeating William Pitt's name. If the British really got Corsica, the French would probably no longer be able to regard the Western Mediterranean as their own backyard. Even in the affairs of Italy and Spain, the British would have a stronger voice. In addition to the French Navy's right to station in the port, Lawrence observed the Duke Choiseul's expression and knew that he understood what he meant, so he further expressed his concession and said, the French army can also station troops in Corsica, but only in the suburbs of Ajaccio, and the Corsican government needs to share the command of the garrison. Duke Choiseul let out a long breath and decided to temporarily put William Pitt's matter out of his mind and focus on the current negotiations. Mr. Bonaparte, our garrison is protecting Corsica. Duke Choiseul took a piece of steamed cake from the round table beside him and stuffed it into his mouth, shaking his head and saying, why do you say that we have taken advantage of Corsica? After hearing this, Lawrence just smiled and shook his head, pretending to be helpless, and shrugged and said, well, I don't think the British think so. Duke Choiseul licked his lips, squinted at Lawrence, but did not speak, but continued to pick up steamed cakes from the table and feed them into his mouth. It seems that this fermented food with a unique flavor coated with butter made Duke Choiseul very fond of it. There was a brief silence between the two sides, and then Duke Choiseul took out a handkerchief to rub the corners of his mouth, crossed his right leg on his left leg, leaned against the back of the chair and said, you want autonomy, which is difficult. The topic of the two sides returned to Corsica's autonomy. Although Duke Choiseul did not think that Corsica was of great value to France, as a sophisticated politician, he could not directly hand over all the interests to Lawrence. Lawrence knew that the French valued not letting the British get Corsica more than Corsica itself. So Lawrence also lay down in the wide chair and said with regret, if that's the case, the conditions offered by France don't seem to be much better than those of England. Maybe I should obey the opinion of our governor and become a British citizen. After that, Lawrence spread his hands and added, Mr. Pitt promised me a British title. To be honest, this makes me very excited. Although he was a little disgusted with the courtesy in the manner, Duke Choiseul shook his head and took a big sip of the teacup, and then slowly said, okay, Mr. Bonaparte, if you are really excited, you won't be sitting here. I will be honest with you. That's good. Lawrence smiled and nodded. The conditions you listed are not enough to exchange for Corsica's autonomy. Duke Choiseul's voice was very low, giving people a sense of indisputability. Lawrence calmly adjusted his scarf, turned his head and said, the military rights of stationing troops in Hong Kong and limited garrisoning are all. I believe France does not need more. That's true in the military aspect, but not in other aspects. Duke Choiseul said, with greed flashing in his eyes, looking at Lawrence. Please speak. Corsica can have political autonomy, but economically it needs to be incorporated into the French national economic system, forced to unify the currency, establish a common market, and have customs, and French merchant ships must enjoy the lowest tariff treatment. The Duke of Choiseul was worthy of being the minister who had been in charge of France's foreign policy for more than a decade. He fluently proposed a series of regulations to strengthen economic control over Corsica, and added, in addition, culturally, the Corsican government needs to cooperate with our cultural integration. Corsican schools must teach French and Italian at the same time, and there must be a certain proportion of French teachers. Lawrence listened silently, knowing in his heart that this was an inevitable price to pay, so he said, "I generally agree with your opinion. Of course, the specific details need to be discussed in detail after Corsica is pacified. Due to the current tense situation, neither of them has time to hold more than a dozen meetings like Paulie and Pete to discuss each regulation. Therefore, what they are currently pursuing is to reach a consensus on the general direction." "Very good, very good." Seeing Lawrence nod in agreement, Duke Choiseul's expression also relaxed a lot, which meant that the two sides had achieved considerable results in the first round of negotiations. Well, speaking of that, Duke Choiseul's posture was obviously much more relaxed, and he asked with a smile in a casual tone, "Mr. Bonaparte, what are you going to do?" Even in the Palace of Versailles, Duke Choiseul's eyes did not miss Corsica. After learning that a Sardinian army was defeated by the young man in front of him, Duke Choiseul was a little surprised. Only someone with the ability and power of Lawrence could send that letter, which would make Duke Choiseul willing to condescend to come to Toulon to meet him. After listening to this, Lawrence stretched out his finger and dipped it in the teacup, then drew the general outline of Corsica on the table, and said in a deep voice, "The southern part of Corsica is already in my hands. The Sardinian army cannot organize an attack in a short time, and the Southern Corps will obey my orders. Now we need to deal with the Northern Corps and the Genoese in Corsica." Duke Choiseul nodded and said casually, "These are not to worry about. I can directly put pressure on Genoa to make them withdraw from Corsica, including the Northern Corps you mentioned. The troops in these ravines are nothing but a mess." After that, Duke Choiseul's face became a little solemn, looking at Lawrence and continued, "However, there is a prerequisite for France to send troops. You should understand it. A correct version in 1619 book bar." Lawrence also nodded seriously. Of course, he understood what the premise of Duke Choiseul was. No matter in which era, no matter in the East or the West, the use of the army needs to be justified. Although this reason for war may be forged or fabricated, it is indispensable. The best excuse for France to intervene in the Corsica dispute is undoubtedly the crown that Lawrence presented to Louis XV. This means that the control of Ajaccio will become particularly important. Lawrence must become the nominal supreme leader of the entire Corsica for a period of time, thereby announcing the establishment of the Kingdom of Corsica. "I believe in your ability, Mr. Bonaparte." Duke Choiseul stood up and called his secretary from outside, preparing to sign a rough contract with Lawrence first. "By the way, what are you going to do after controlling Ajaccio?" Duke Choiseul asked casually, while waiting for the secretary to draw up the contract. Lawrence picked up the teacup and drank it all in one gulp. After slowly exhaling, he said in a deep voice, "Form a cabinet, establish a constitutional assembly, and declare the establishment of the Kingdom of Corsica." A cabinet and a constitutional assembly, a constitutional monarchy of the Kingdom of Corsica? Duke Choiseul narrowed his eyes and walked to Lawrence, leaned over with interest and whispered, "You, a young man, are so sophisticated, and you know how to do superficial work, pretending to distribute power to the cabinet and the parliament. It's far worse than you." Lawrence shook his head and said, "Maybe." Duke Choiseul took the draft prepared by the clerk and took a look at it, then handed it to Lawrence for review, and said seriously, "If everything goes well, I will have to call you Prime Minister Bonaparte." Lawrence took the draft calmly and reviewed it twice, and after confirming that it was correct, he handed it back to Duke Choiseul. As for what the Duke of Choiseul said, Lawrence would only respond silently in his heart. If everything goes well, the hat of the Prime Minister of Corsica will not exist for long. Thanks to the book friend Yelakan Kantal for the monthly ticket. Chapter 104 New Captain. 1770. The negotiations between Paoli and Pitt were basically over. Even in the printing house in Ajaccio, a contract with more than 30 pages and the smell of ink had been published. At the end of the contract, Paoli and Pitt also solemnly signed their cursive names on behalf of their respective people. The contract had been signed, and the huge stone pressing on Paola's heart finally loosened half. The remaining half would not be completely relieved until the contract was fully disclosed. At the same time, in order to highlight the legitimacy of his actions, Paoli also knew that the publication of the contract could not be done overnight. Therefore, he specially sent people to secretly deliver copies of the contract to the members of parliament, and coerced and induced the members of parliament in exchange for their public recognition of the legitimacy of the contract at a specific time. Of course, the citizens of Ajaccio were unaware of the dark clouds gathering in the governor's palace. For them, there was something more worthy of attention recently. Napoleon Bonaparte was ordered by Pauli to be relieved of all his duties in the patrol and the National Defense Force, and only retained the honorary title of Lieutenant Colonel of the National Defense Force. As for the affairs of the patrol, its original captain, Captain Head, took over. TSK, this Lawrence, he has done a good job in managing this rotten place. Captain Head put his hands behind his back and walked into the patrol station hall like a leisurely garden, looking around wantonly, and couldn't help licking his lips and said proudly, as the nominal highest officer of the patrol, Captain Head's official position was just bought from Pauli by spending money to manage some relationships. As for him, he is a wealthy landowner who owns a lot of land and tenants in the countryside. Sir, who are you? A patrolman saw Captain Head rushing in so ostentatiously and quickly stretched out his hand to stop him and asked, "Hey?" Captain Head ignored the patrolman's question, but sneered at him and shouted with an unhappy face, "What's the matter? Don't you recognize me?" The patrolman frowned and looked at Captain Head. From the large number of gold and silver jewelry on him, he could tell that he was a rich man, but his speech and behavior were so rude. He was definitely an Alvorish, so he said impatiently, "Are you here to report a crime or something else? Tell me your purpose quickly, otherwise I have the right to expel you." "Fuck you." Captain Head was immediately furious. In his farm, which tenants dared to talk to him like this, so he raised his palm without any hesitation and slapped him directly. Bang! A loud slapping sound instantly attracted the attention of the patrolmen in the hall. They were also shocked and angry. They drew their sabers and pointed at Captain Head and shouted, "How dare you attack the patrolmen openly? Attack your mother's head." "I did hit him, so what?" Captain Head snorted coldly, pointed at the patrolmen in front of him and cursed, then took out Pauli's warrant and slapped it on the table, shouting wantonly, "Damn it, open your dog eyes and see clearly who I am." The patrolmen stepped forward and looked at the warrant on the table, and then looked at Captain Head in shock, remembering that they still had a nominal captain, and Lawrence had only served as the deputy captain in the past 2 years. And because Captain Head lived in the countryside all year round, even if he went to the city, he would not live in the dilapidated fortress of the patrol. So few patrolmen knew him. What happened? Old Scene rushed to the hall after hearing the noise downstairs. Looking at Caled, who was wearing gold and silver, his eyes widened, and he said in surprise, "You are Captain Caled. Why are you here?" In Old Scene's impression, Captain Caled only used the patrol team as a tool to make money. Most of the protection fees, hush money, bail, etc. collected by the patrolmen before were set up by him, and most of the money went into his pocket. A patrolman poked Old Scene and showed him Paula's warrant on the table. "You want to take over here?" Old Scene looked at Paula's warrant in disbelief and cried out, "HMPH, I remember you, Old Scene, right?" Captain Harold looked at Old Scene and said with a shake of his head, "Finally, there is someone familiar. You, take me around here. I haven't been here for a few years." After that, Captain Harold patted the patrolman's face in front of him and said teasingly, "Do you remember my face? Be smarter next time. You." The patrolman clenched his fists and blushed. He took a step forward with his chest straightened and stared at Captain Harold. Seeing this, Old Scene hurriedly stepped forward and pulled the patrolman behind him and winked at him. Before Lawrence left, he told them that the patrol team had to keep a low profile until he came back. Old Scene, who kept this order in mind, was so angry that his teeth were itching, but he still forced a smile and said, "Haha, Captain Head, please follow me. I will show you around now." Captain Head looked at the humble Old Scene and was satisfied. He followed the Old Scene's footsteps and walked around the station. About half an hour later, Captain Head, who returned to the hall, could no longer hide the greed on his face. He pointed at Old Scene and cursed that Bonaparte is just an idiot. There are so many prisoners in the dungeon, and these are already made gold and silver. Collect a bail from each person, and it will be issued now. Read the correct version in 1619 book bar. This. Old Scene's mouth twitched, and he said with a grim expression, there are dangerous elements in there, and many of them are gang members who have killed several people. If they are released. Huh. Old Scene, I remember that you didn't talk so much when you were making money with me before. Captain Cale stared at Old Scene in surprise, waved his hand and said, we are not a fucking welfare home. Just release the criminals, and we can collect more protection fees if the crime rate outside is high. That Bonaparte can't figure this out. He's so stupid. Old Scene lowered his head and said nothing, forcing himself to swallow his anger back into his stomach. HMPH, forget it. I'll collect the bail money slowly. These prisoners can't run away anyway. Captain Hale had just changed the subject from the dungeon, and before he could let Old Scene breathe a sigh of relief, he suddenly lowered his voice, grinned greedily and fanatically, and said, also, Old Scene, what are those cash boxes on the top floor of yours used for? You. Old Scene immediately stood up with the help of the table, and said repeatedly with trembling anger, that is the share of all patrolmen, and it belongs to all of them. TSK. Captain Hale clicked his tongue unhappily, and said righteously, what a bullshit share. You all have a stable job, and you don't even think about being grateful? What share are you still thinking about? Do you have a spirit of dedication? You only know how to get money every day. Do you work for money? After that, Captain Hale no longer concealed his true face. He coughed twice and said, also, it's not safe to keep the cash box here, and it will affect your mind. I'll send someone to move it away in a few days, and keep it properly for you. Old Scene had already put his hands on his forehead and kept silent, trying not to listen to Captain Head's words. At the same time, he prayed sincerely in his heart over and over again, God, please let Mr. Bonaparte come back soon, otherwise I will not be able to help but hang this bastard on the street lamp with my own hands. Chapter 105 Everything is Ready, Part 1. Hey, Ajaccio hasn't changed much in the past 2 years. On the streets of Ajaccio, Captain Head was leading a dozen patrolmen including Old Scene, walking through the streets and alleys with a proud look in the eyes of the crowd. In the past 2 years, although Captain Head lived in the countryside, he had heard of Lawrence's reputation in the patrol team, as well as the two backers behind him, Carlo and Paulie. Therefore, Captain Head, who bullied the weak and feared the strong, was very sensible and did not run to the city to cause trouble. However, this did not mean that Captain Head swallowed the anger of being usurped. In his eyes, the position of captain was bought at a high price. This Bonaparte kid immediately rectified the discipline of the team and cut off all his grey income at once, which made Captain Head not get a silver coin from the patrol team for 2 whole years. Now that he received Paula's order to return to the patrol team and take power, Captain Head's first thought was to let all the people in Ajaccio see who is in charge of the patrol team now. Hey, Old Scene, what do you think of me wearing this? Captain Head turned his head and asked Old Scene proudly, pulling hard on the patrol uniform of the same style as Lawrence. Old Scene glanced at the big-shouldered head. His big belly and fat around his waist were almost as wide as his shoulders. Even the belt on his waist was tied at the widest part. It seemed that he had not neglected nutrition in his daily life. Oh, of course it fits perfectly, Old Scene said with a smile, enduring the condemnation of his conscience. That's about right. Captain Head became even more complacent after hearing this. He looked up and hummed a little tune while leading the patrol soldiers towards the market. He wanted to tell all the citizens in the busiest place that he, Head, was now the master of the patrol team. Look, it's the patrolmen. Yes, Old Scene is here too. Wait, who is the fat guy next to him? I don't know. He's wearing a uniform too, and it seems to be the captain's uniform. This can't be. The people in the market soon noticed the patrolmen coming in line, and the sudden appearance of Captain Head's unfamiliar face immediately caused many people to whisper. Compared with the puzzled citizens, many of the older vendors present soon showed expressions of fear and panic. Captain Head's fat and big-eared appearance was once their lingering nightmare. Before being reorganized by Lawrence, the patrol team would extort a large amount of money from these vendors every now and then, and the reasons for extortion were endless, from protection fees to back taxes, which could be different for half a year. and if anyone dared to defy this extortion, Captain Head would be very happy to open the Corsican law and choose a crime he liked from the dazzling array of crimes in it and directly put it on that person's head. That's scaled. How come he's back on patrol again? An elderly vegetable farmer who was pushing a flatbed cart wiped his cold sweat with a towel on his shoulder. Then he couldn't help but shout in surprise at Captain Caled. After shouting, the old farmer couldn't help but touch the creepy dark red scar on his abdomen, which was the punishment he received after he was late paying a fine requested by Captain Caled a few years ago. It turned out to be Caled. Oh my god, how could it be him? What is Governor Paul thinking? How could he let such a person replace Lord Bonaparte? As the old farmer shouted out Captain Caled's identity, many citizens who had never seen him in person, but had heard of this notorious villain began to discuss among themselves. Captain Caled's face instantly turned cold, and he also heard the discussion of these citizens, especially the fact that someone said that he replaced Lawrence, which made him furious. Captain Hale took 2 steps forward, pointed at the old farmer's nose and shouted, "You damn mudleg, what are you yelling for?" The old vegetable farmer was as thin as a bamboo pole, and his body was hunched because of his old age. He couldn't even raise his head in front of Captain Hale. The old farmer's body curled up slightly, hesitating for a long time without saying a word, and had to push the flatbed cart full of vegetables backwards in fear. "Damn, did I tell you to leave?" Captain Hale took 2 steps to catch up, raised his leg and hit the old farmer's flatbed cart that was squeaking and about to fall apart with a heavy knee strike. There was a clang. The old farmer's strength was no match for Captain Hale, who weighed more than 200 pounds. He rolled over and fell to the muddy ground with the cart. The old farmer struggled to get up from the mud, but he didn't care about the scratches on his body that had already started bleeding. He stared at the muddy ground in front of him. A dozen fresh green cabbages were lying in the mud, all covered with dust. Many of them had been crushed by the fallen flatbed truck and rotted in the ground. "Vegetables, my vegetables, my vegetables. These can be sold for 4 silver coins. This is the busiest market in Ajaccio. But at this moment, it is the quietest place in Ajaccio." The helpless and pitiful murmurs of the old farmer are clearly heard by every citizen present. "What a bullshit." Captain Hale pouted and took 2 steps forward, looking at a cabbage that still looks good. He raised his right foot wearing leather shoes and stepped hard. A correct version in the 16:9 book forum. Puff. The broken leaves mixed into the mud, making an uncomfortable sound. "Enough. Captain Harold, enough." Old Scene stepped forward quickly, helped the vegetable farmer stand up, and shouted at Captain Harold sternly, "No matter what, these vegetables are his property. You have no right to do this." "Property? Okay, I'll compensate him." Captain Harold was about to get angry, but suddenly paused, then nodded with a sneer. After that, Captain Harold took out his purse, that was bulging like a ball from his arms, took out a gold coin from it, squatted down and shook it in front of the old farmer, and then said, "Mudleg, this gold coin is my compensation to you." The vegetable farmer stared at the gold coin in front of him, and it seemed that even the wound on his body didn't hurt anymore. He stretched out his hand and wanted to take the gold coin. Captain Hale suddenly sneered, held the gold coin in his palm like a magic trick, and said jokingly, "Wait, I haven't finished yet. I will compensate you with 1 gold coin, but the fine for you is 2 gold coins." "Fine? What fine? What did he do?" Old Scene said loudly, unable to bear it any longer. "HMPH. Captain Head stood up and kicked the flatbed cart that had completely fallen apart twice, saying in a cold voice, "He pushed a cart and set up a stall here. Isn't this affecting the city appearance? Isn't this occupying the road? In my opinion, 2 gold coins are not enough." As soon as he finished speaking, Captain Head turned his head to look at other vendors, licked his lips, and seemed to have smelled the smell of coins, and said loudly, "And you, all stay where you are, and prepare the fines. I will check if you have any violations right away." "You." Old Scene glared, and his right hand could not help but hold the handle of the knife. He took several deep breaths to hold back his breath, and then took out a few gold coins from his wallet and secretly stuffed them into the vegetable farmer. And these citizens who were watching, under the tyranny of Captain Head, had to speed up and leave here. However, they could never forget the poor vegetable farmer lying in the muddy field. Even a saint would gnash his teeth when he thought of the scene of Herod raising his right foot and trampling on the cabbages. As a result, many citizens had already planted the seeds of dissatisfaction with Paulie. After all, it was Governor Paulie himself who ordered the replacement of Mr. Bonaparte with a cruel Captain Herod. Of course, no one noticed that in the crowd, a young man hidden in a linen cloak silently watched all this happen, and then followed the dispersing crowd, and disappeared at the corner of the street. Chapter 106 Everything is Ready, Part 2. In the markets of the North and South districts, the disturbance caused by Captain Herod has not yet dissipated. Under his mandatory order, the patrolmen were forced to control the vendors, and then used various fines and fees to empty the wallets of each of them. At first, several young and strong men stood up to resist, but soon, as their bloody bodies fell in the market, no one dared to stand up to Herod's atrocities. At the same time, the East District of Ajaccio was not peaceful. Alas. Carlo leaned over the desk, staring at the beautifully printed gold-stamped envelope and the dozens of pages of thick letter paper on the desk, and sighed continuously. On the opened envelope, it can be seen from the wax seal that this is a letter from the governor's palace, and it is a private letter sent by Paulie himself. Maria sang a lullaby quietly while holding the sleeping little Napoleon in her arms, and walked into Carlo's study. Seeing Carlo still sighing, she asked worriedly in a low voice, "Dear, what's wrong with you? You haven't stopped sighing for almost an hour." Carlo stood up silently, walked to Maria, took the little Napoleon from her hands, and gently stroked the broken hair on Napoleon's forehead with his hands. "Give the child to the nanny for a while, then come to me. Remember to close the door when you come in." Carlo only held the baby for a short while, then handed the swaddling clothes back to Maria. After giving the instructions, he bent over the desk and read the letters. After a while, Maria returned to the study, closed the door tightly, and then sat opposite Carlo, tilting her head, wanting to see what was written in the letter on the table. "Such a thick letter, is it a case you are responsible for?" Maria asked with a slight frown. Carlo shook his head slowly, picked up the letter, and sorted it out, then carefully put it in the drawer, looked at Maria and said seriously, "My dear, you can't tell anyone what I'm going to say next, at least not in the next few days. I swear to God, I won't." Maria made a cross on her chest and said. Carlo took a deep breath, closed his eyes, hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We are going to become British." "British?" Maria looked at Carlo in surprise, not knowing why her husband said that. "To be precise, the Corsicans are going to become British." Carlo held his forehead, couldn't help but sigh, and said, "Governor Paul sent me this letter, saying that at the beginning of next month in the parliament, I need to vote in favor of Corsica's annexation to England." The two people in the study looked at each other in silence for a moment. Maria patted Carlo's shoulder and said with a soft smile, "No matter what decision you make, my children and I will support you." "Thank you, Maria." Carlo shook his head with a bitter smile and added, "Governor Paulie did promise me generous conditions, saying that he would still retain my status as a member of parliament and would also make me a British lord. But I think I still have to talk to Lawrence about this matter." Maria also nodded in understanding and said, "But didn't your brother go to visit Count Marbeuf? Is he back?" "I don't know. Maybe I should write a letter to ask Count Marbeuf." Carlo stood up in distress and said that, although his brother had been dismissed from his position, he still had a good influence in Ajaccio, which was also an important reason why Carlo hoped to get Lawrence's opinion. However, there was only 1 week left before the regular parliament at the beginning of next month, and Carlo was a little worried whether Lawrence could come back during this time. Just when Carlo was hesitant, he heard his butler suddenly knock on the wooden door of the study. "Come in," Carlo said casually. The butler pushed the door open, holding an opened envelope in his hand, bowed to Carlo and said, "Sir, a little boy knocked on the door just now, saying that he had sent a letter at someone's request. I have checked the content, and it seems to be an invitation." For such an unknown letter, the butler would naturally confirm the content in advance, so Carlo was not angry, but took the letter from the butler and glanced at it with some doubt. The content of the letter was very simple, just hoping that Carlo could change into casual clothes immediately and go to an ordinary tavern in the southern city. This handwriting. Carlo stared at the letter for a long time and suddenly exclaimed, "This is Lawrence's handwriting." "Really?" Maria asked in disbelief. "He went back to Ajaccio? Why didn't he come here directly?" "I don't know. He may have his considerations." Carlo glanced at the name of the tavern on the letter again, then swallowed nervously, folded the letter in his hand, and tore it into pieces. Paula's letter and Lawrence's letter were delivered at almost the same time, which made Carlo vaguely aware of something. According to Lawrence's request, Carlo deliberately changed into a simple long-sleeved cloth and walked to the tavern mentioned in the letter. Here, as soon as Carlo entered the door, a young man who covered half of his body with a linen cloak poked his back secretly and then led him to a table in the corner to sit down. "Lawrence, it's really you. Why are you dressed like this? And why did Governor Pauly remove all your official positions?" Carlo looked at the face under the cloak. It was indeed his brother. He was surprised and happy and asked in a low voice. Lawrence just shook his head and said in a deep voice, "Paul wants to give Corsica to the British. I don't want to, that's it." Carlo said in surprise, "Huh? How do you know that Governor Paul wants to annex Corsica to Britain?" Lawrence was also stunned for a moment and asked back, "Wait, it's you, Carlo, how did you know?" "Governor Paul sent a letter a few hours ago, and it mentioned in the letter," Carlo explained in a low voice. Lawrence couldn't help but frowned after hearing this, lowered his head, and pondered for a while, and said to himself, "If this is the case, all members of parliament should have received this news, which means, in the 16-9 book, the correct version." Lawrence suddenly raised his head, looked at Carlo and asked, "The regular parliament at the beginning of next month?" "Yes, that's right." Carlo didn't expect Lawrence to guess so much information from his words, and nodded subconsciously. Lawrence waved to call the waiter and ordered 2 glasses of beer casually, making the two of them look more like real drinkers. After taking a sip from the glass, Lawrence swallowed the sour beer in his mouth with a nausea-inducing feeling. Then he put the glass aside and whispered seriously, "Carlo, what do you think of Paul's actions?" Carlo paused for a moment with some hesitation and whispered, "Governor Pauly gave me very good conditions, but I think for other people, I mean ordinary Corsicans, this may not be a good thing." Lawrence listened silently, occasionally nodding in agreement. "By the way, Lawrence." Carlo's face already showed a worried look. He sighed, looked at Lawrence and said, "You just said that you oppose Governor Paul's resolution, so what are you going to do? You no longer have an official position. You don't have the right to vote in parliament, and my vote will not play any role. Overthrow him." "What? Overthrow him? You overthrow Governor Pauly?" Carlo almost couldn't control his voice, and even the hand holding the glass couldn't help shaking, spilling beer on his legs. "I will end Paul's era at the parliament on April 1st. Lawrence said quietly in a low voice, as if he was talking about what to eat for dinner today. "I don't understand how to overthrow it. This is not a joke, Lawrence." Carlo looked around nervously to make sure that no one else could hear their conversation. Lawrence leaned forward a little, lowered his voice, and told Carlo about his contract with the Duke of Choiseul. "This is crazy, but..." Carlo didn't come back to his senses from Lawrence's plan for a while, until he took a big sip of beer and sobered up a little and said, "This is indeed the only way for us to continue to call ourselves Corsicans. What are you going to do, Carlo?" Lawrence nodded and asked. Carlo took a deep breath, and the lovely appearance of his wife and children flashed in his mind. He made up his mind and said, "I will support you, Lawrence." After Carlo left the tavern, in order not to arouse suspicion, Lawrence continued to sit in his seat and drank all the sour beer in small sips. "I wanted to ask Carlo to help me keep an eye on Paula's movements, but I didn't expect to find out the time when Pauly would make the treaty public." Lawrence moved the empty wine glass aside, waved to the waiter, and slapped a few silver coins on the table. Then he stood up and murmured in a low voice, "April 1st. For Pauly, maybe he hopes that everything on that day was just an April Fool's joke." Thanks to book friend Michael SC6 for his monthly ticket and reward support. Thank you very much. Chapter 107 The Curtain Rises, Part 1. 1770, in the Governor's Palace in Ajaccio. Governor, the replies from the parliamentarians have been collected. Paula's secretary knocked on the door and walked into the study, placing a stack of letters neatly on the table and said, "Ah, not bad, not bad." Paulie immediately threw the work on his hands aside, happily picked up the replies from the parliamentarians and quickly read through them. For Paulie, as long as the resolution to join England is officially passed in Parliament tomorrow, this poor and backward island will have almost nothing to do with him. He can buy a large piece of land in the countryside of London with a generous annuity, enjoy the service of hundreds of maids and servants, and whenever he walks on the streets of London, people will nod to him respectfully and call him the Count or Duke of Corsica. All this is much more comfortable than staying in Corsica to guard this rotten land. Well, in general, all the members of Parliament have expressed their support for your bill. Of course, there are also a few who are not very satisfied with their treatment and hope to discuss with you again after the Parliament. The secretary also knew that Paulie did not have time to read all these letters full of red tape and flattery, so he skillfully repeated the main content for Paulie. "Okay, you draft a unified reply for me and tell those dissatisfied members to meet with me after the Parliament ends. At the same time, warn them that I don't want to see any mistakes in tomorrow's Parliament." Paulie randomly picked a few replies and took a few glances. He soon lost interest in these hypocritical words. After sorting out the replies, he instructed the secretary, "Oh, right." Paulie suddenly remembered something and rummaged through the envelope in his hand again and asked at the same time, "Is Carlo Bonaparte's reply in it?" "Yes, and there is no problem with Mr. Bonaparte's reply." The secretary stepped forward and took out a very simple pure white envelope for Paulie and handed it to Paulie. Paulie pulled out the letter and glanced at it with a frown. The content of the letter was the same as that of other members of Parliament, full of flattering praise for his wise decision and pledge to support him in Parliament. Humph, Carlo is quite sensible, much more reassuring than his brother. Paulie then put all the envelopes aside with satisfaction, stretched his body, and said with a self-satisfied smile, "Oh, I almost forgot. Lawrence is also a young man who knows the times. He left Ajaccio and has not returned yet." In Paula's heart, he had not been so relaxed for a long time. Everything was going quite smoothly. Lawrence, the biggest enemy, had given up fighting with him, and all the members of Parliament had succumbed to coercion and inducement. This feeling of holding absolute power and having everything go as he wished made Paulie seem to have returned to the state of power when he just established the Republic of Corsica. Ahem, Governor, there is one more thing I need to report to you. The secretary stood there and hesitated for a while, but still interrupted Paul's complacent state and said with his head down, "Didn't you let the former patrol captain take over the affairs of the team a few days ago? He seems to be in Ajaccio recently." "Huh, you mean that?" Although Paul was very unhappy about being suddenly interrupted, he rubbed his forehead and thought for a while and said, "That killed. What trouble did he cause?" The secretary thought for a while with a difficult expression, as if looking for a euphemism, then shook his head and said, "He takes people to various shops to extort every day, and even street vendors are not spared. Many people bleed in the process. In addition, it is said that he also kidnapped several girls in his residence. This damn country bumpkin." Paul frowned unhappily, but did not express anything. He just said with disgust, "But it doesn't matter. Didn't he do this in the past few years?" "It was true a few years ago, but..." The secretary looked at Paulie carefully and said slowly, "But since Lawrence Bonaparte reorganized the patrol team, no such thing has happened again. Now that Harold is going against the grain, many citizens find it hard to accept, and they all miss Lawrence Bonaparte. TSK." Paulie shook his head unkindly and said, "There's nothing I can do about it. I can only feel at ease if Lawrence's official position is removed. As for the citizens' discussions, humph, they can't turn the tables anyway, so let's make them suffer first and let the British have a headache about this." The secretary looked at Paulie in surprise. If this kind of thing happened normally, Governor Paulie would still do some superficial work to win people's hearts. Now that he was about to leave Corsica, Paulie was no longer willing to do such things to appease the citizens. "Anything else?" Paulie looked at the secretary, who was stunned, and asked impatiently. The secretary quickly came to his senses, looked at the schedule in his hand, and reported, "Oh, and Mr. Peter, He will see you at 2 p.m., which is 10 minutes later. Well, go and inform him now. I'll wait for him here. Paulie nodded and said, and picked up the replies from the congressman and read them with relish as reading materials to kill time. Mr. Peter, you don't look well. Paulie frowned and looked at the door, where Peter was slowly supported by his entourage, and said with great concern, "It's an old problem, nothing." Pitt sat down on the chair tremblingly, waved his hand and said, "It got better a few days ago, but after the young man Lawrence left, there was no one to guide his recuperation, and it got worse again." Paulie nodded in understanding, patted his chest and said, "Don't worry, Lawrence has accepted your invitation, and he will probably be able to return to London with you on the reasonable in a few days." Well, that's good. Let's not talk about this for now. After sitting down on the chair, Pitt's eyes became sharp again, staring at Paulie, and said in a deep voice, "Look at the correct version in the 1619 book bar. Is everything arranged?" "Of course." Paulie also nodded seriously, and then said, "The parliamentarians have all reached an agreement, and I have also invited representatives from all walks of life in Ajaccio to attend the meeting, and let them witness and recognize the legality of the treaty." "Very good, Governor Paulie, I believe you will not let me down." Pitt nodded with satisfaction. His eyes softened and relaxed a bit, so that his mission in Corsica was successfully completed. For Pitt, his negotiation in Corsica was a great success. He obtained an extremely important Mediterranean port for the Kingdom of England without spending a single soldier, and what he promised was just some insignificant noble titles. After returning home, Pitt could use this achievement to shut up his political opponents for a while, and he might even regain the respect of King George III of England, and achieve his goal of returning to politics. Paulie got up, opened the window, and looked at the scenery outside. From here, you can see the bell tower of the governor's palace, and the Corsican flag fluttering in the sea breeze on the bell tower. Paulie stared at the flag for a moment, as if he remembered that he had designed and hung the flag himself. But such thoughts only flashed through his mind for a moment, and Paulie quickly shook his head and laughed twice, then turned around, pointed at the flag, and said to Pete, "At 12 o'clock noon tomorrow, the Red Cross flag will be flying here." Pete also stood up with the help of the table, squinted at the Corsican flag in the sun, and said calmly, "For the Corsicans, a new era is coming." Paulie nodded twice with a very small amplitude, but his eyes did not move away from the bell tower. After a while of silence, he slowly said, "No matter what era it is, it has nothing to do with me." Pete raised his eyebrows in surprise and said, "They are your people, and you don't care about their future fate." Paulie shook his head slowly and firmly, and uttered a sentence effortless, "I don't care." However, after hearing this, Pete couldn't help but smile at the corner of his mouth. At the same time, he patted Paulie on the shoulder, and said with a smile, "Governor Paulie, for us British people, your awareness is what we most want to see." Paulie was stunned for a moment, but soon understood what Pete meant. It seems that the Corsicans will not have a good life under British rule. Paulie glanced at Pete expressionlessly and said, before Pete replied, he shook his head, closed the window, sat back in his seat and said, "But forget it. As I said, all this has nothing to do with me, and I don't care." Thanks to the book friend Paladin 1996 for the monthly ticket and reward. Thank you very much. Chapter 108 The Curtain Rises, Part 2. 1770. In the outskirts of Ajaccio, the National Defense Army stationed. Alas, with such ingredients, the bullet strength is not enough. Major Trifoli scratched his head in distress, and kept stabbing a small piece of cork in his hand with a dagger. After the triumph of Bonifacio, Major Trifoli also got more feedback from those precision shooters on the actual use of rifles. So in these days, he was basically busy with the design and improvement of bullets and firearms. Even the wooden house, where Major Trifoli lived, was moved into by him with countless raw materials, parts, tools, and equipment, which were piled up on the ground in a mess, everywhere, and there was not even a place to stay. "Major, excuse me." There was a knock on the door, followed by a loud report from a young soldier. Major Trifoli was also familiar with this voice. It was his personal guard. In addition to simple security work, the guards served more as secretaries for these officers. "Come in." Major Trifoli greeted without looking up, and continued to examine the cork in his hand. "Yes." The guard responded and pushed open the door, tiptoed carefully among the scattered parts, and walked around a corner before coming to Major Trifoli. "Major, this is your letter today," the guard said, putting a few envelopes on the table, and then waited for Major Trifoli's order. Major Trifoli sighed, put the cork aside, and glanced at the envelopes impatiently. As a well-known firearms craftsman, Major Trifoli often received letters from wealthy businessmen and dignitaries, asking him to customize those flashy pistols, to show off their power or wealth. "Are those commission letters again? I told you to throw these letters aside, don't bother me with them." Major Trifoli frowned, and said with some displeasure. The guard also scratched his head in shame, but did not speak. It was obvious that he had received a lot of benefits from those clients when he handed over the letters. "By the way, Major, there is a letter inside. It is not a commission, and I can't understand the content, but the envelope does say it is sent to you." Seeing that Major Cui Fala's face was getting uglier, the guard quickly changed the subject and stuffed one of the worn and slightly yellowed envelopes into Major Cui Fala's hand. There was almost no content on the cover, only a short line of small words, indicating that it was sent to Major Cui Fala of the National Defense Force. Major Cui Fala opened the envelope in confusion, took out the letter paper, and spread it on the table. There was no greeting, no closing, no salutation or signature on this huge piece of letter paper. There was only one word on the whole white paper: start. Start? Major Cui Fala scratched his hair twice and could not see any clues at all. Just when Major Trifoli was upset and thought that this was a prank by a bad-tempered child, an inconspicuous pattern in the lower right corner of the letter suddenly attracted his attention. "This is..." Major Trifoli stared at the pattern for 2 seconds and saw that the upper part of the pattern was a pointed cone and the lower part was a rectangle with a half circle cut out. Major Trifoli, who dealt with it every day, recognized this pattern instantly. "Isn't this the shape of the mini-A bullet?" Knowing the structure of the mini-A bullet, this must be Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte. Major Trifoli suddenly realized that this was a letter from Lawrence. In this case, the meaning of this beginning is to say, after knowing that this was a letter from Lawrence, Major Trifoli nervously and excitedly looked at the word beginning in the center of the letter again. Thinking of the plan that Lawrence had given them when they returned to Ajaccio that day, Major Trifoli immediately understood that the weather in Corsica would change from now on. Major?" The guard stood aside awkwardly, watching Major Trifoli suddenly stare at the almost blank letter, and couldn't help but say, "Have you been overworked these days?" Major Trifoli ignored the guard, but closed his eyes hard to calm himself down, and then said to the guard in a deep voice, "Guard, go find Lieutenant Set immediately, and tell him to come to me now." "Ah, yes." Although the guard didn't know what happened, he saluted when he saw Major Trifoli's serious expression, and ran out of the door without caring whether he would step on any parts. At the same time, in the south of Corsica, Bonifacio, because the former Supreme Commander of the Southern Legion, Colonel Silva, unfortunately died on the battlefield and sacrificed his life for the country, Lawrence asked among the soldiers before leaving and appointed an officer with both moral integrity and ability to take over as the commander of the Southern Legion. Of course, Governor Pauly naturally didn't know and wouldn't accept that Lawrence had appointed a corps commander on his own initiative. So after learning of Colonel Silva's death, he urgently sent a loyal colonel as the official commander. At this moment, in Bonifacio's camp, the officer appointed by Lawrence, like other soldiers, sat by the campfire, but he did not join the soldiers' chat, but read a letter from Ajaccio with a serious expression. "Hey, sir, what are you looking at?" A soldier noticed the officer's serious expression and couldn't help asking, "Is it from relatives in Ajaccio?" A soldier saw the place of mail on the envelope and asked with concern. The officer just shook his head silently, but did not explain the content of the letter, and still scanned the content of the letter paper intently. The soldiers looked at each other in confusion, wondering what this cheerful and enthusiastic officer was looking at that made him so serious. After a while, the officer finally finished reading the whole letter, but his face still didn't relax at all. After hesitating for a moment, he threw the whole letter into the bonfire beside him, and it turned into ashes. "Sir, who sent it?" Seeing this, the soldiers became even more curious and came up to ask. The officer stood up, patted the dust on his body, and said in a deep voice, "It was sent by Mr. Bonaparte." The soldiers were so surprised that they couldn't close their mouths, and they kept discussing. Mr. Bonaparte? A correct version is available on the 16-9 book forum. The commander who fought with us to win the Battle of Bonifacio. Yes, it was him who captured General Burlane alive 2 years ago. Commander, what did Lord Bonaparte say in his letter? Faced with a tide of questions, the officer could only signal everyone to be quiet, and then said, "Lord Bonaparte hopes that we, the Southern Army, can immediately march to Ajaccio, and accept his command." As soon as the words fell, the soldiers were shocked and stunned for a few seconds. Everyone knew that Lawrence was truly overstepping his authority. Once held accountable by General Pauly, neither side would be able to escape the responsibility. Seeing everyone standing there in a daze, the officer immediately said, "I also know that this is a major violation of the order, but I still decided to accept the order of Lord Bonaparte, because that day, on the plain outside Bonifacio, I saw Lord Bonaparte abandon his mountain march with us and the artillery fire." The officer's words immediately evoked the soldiers' memories of the Battle of Bonifacio that day. They thought of the young Commander Bonaparte, his roaring questioning before the battle, his march under the artillery fire on the battlefield, and his sincere oath to mourn for the heroic soul after the war. Maybe there will never be such a commander in this life. This is what many soldiers thought after the war. However, now, there is an opportunity in front of them. Whether to go north to Ajaccio to follow the footsteps of Lord Bonaparte, or stay in Bonifacio and rust and rot here for a lifetime. Many people already have the answer in their hearts. March to Ajaccio. March to Ajaccio. March to Ajaccio. The soldiers' excited shouts instantly spread throughout Bonifacio. And just a moment later, a loud shout outside the camp suddenly interrupted the soldiers' shouts. "Hey, you bunch of pigs. What are you doing? What are you arguing about?" Outside the camp, the colonel who took over as commander rushed in angrily, pointing at the soldiers and scolding them. The officer walked up to the colonel without changing his expression and said loudly, "We are going to prepare to march, and the destination is Ajaccio." March. Ridiculous. Whose order? The colonel's face immediately turned pale after hearing this, and he roared, "The order of Lord Bonaparte." The officer responded neither servile nor arrogant. "Bonaparte? Lawrence Bonaparte? He has been dismissed. What order does he have the right to give?" The colonel pointed at the officer's nose and shouted, "You are General Pauly's soldiers. No one else's orders will work except General Pauly's. No, we trust Mr. Bonaparte who has fought side by side with us more." The officer stood in front of the colonel and did not give in. You traitor." The colonel's face was swollen with anger, and he could no longer speak. He directly drew out the saber from his waist and stabbed the officer. The officer's reaction was even faster. In an instant, he also drew out the saber and held it in his hand, blocking the colonel's stab. Then he turned his wrist and exerted a little force and actually shook the colonel's saber out of his hand. Under the colonel's shocked gaze, the officer did not hesitate at all, stepped forward, and the tip of the knife moved forward with his body and sank into the colonel's heart. Woo wow. The soldiers watched the colonel's body fall silently, watching their nominal supreme commander die in front of them. The officer raised his bloody saber and didn't look at the colonel who was still breathing. He knew there was no turning back. He had no choice but to trust Monsieur Bonaparte. Soldiers, march to Ajaccio. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 109, Riot, Part 1. When Bonifacio's southern army rushed to Ajaccio overnight, Ajaccio, the center of the storm, was not calm either. Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set, what's up? Lieutenant Colonel Redu, the commander of the Ajaccio garrison, was busy annotating the documents on his desk. Seeing the two suddenly coming to visit him, he stood up to greet them with some surprise. Major Trifoli walked into the room with Lieutenant Set with a calm face, glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Redu's desk, and saw that it was covered with various documents and topographical diagrams, so he said apologetically, "Sorry to bother you so late, are you busy at work?" Lieutenant Colonel Redo sighed, sorted out the documents on the desk, and said, "It's true that General Paulie asked us to send troops to assist in the security work in the city tomorrow. The order was very urgent, and we didn't have much time to prepare. Assist in the security work in the city?" Major Trifoli secretly exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Set, and both of them understood, while Lawrence asked them to act at this time. It seemed that Paulie was indeed preparing to make some big moves tomorrow. Tomorrow? Major Trifoli pretended to be ignorant, and asked in confusion, "Isn't there a routine meeting of the Parliament tomorrow? Why did they suddenly ask us to assist in security this time?" Lieutenant Colonel Redo glanced at Trifoli vigilantly, and after not seeing any clues from his expression, he casually said, "Aren't you close to those patrolmen? Don't you know? Patrolmen? What happened?" Major Trifoli asked with a frown. He had been staying at home these days to improve the guns, so he naturally didn't know the disturbance caused by Captain Haled in the city. After Bonaparte left, a new captain came. Lieutenant Colonel Redo shook his head helplessly, shrugged and said, "The citizens in the city are complaining. Tomorrow is an important day. General Paulie will of course worry about the citizens causing trouble." "That's true." Major Cui Fally showed an expression of "I see," and said intentionally or unintentionally, "But General Paulie also attaches great importance to this parliament. I don't know if there are any important proposals. Who knows?" Lieutenant Colonel Redo frowned, obviously not intending to continue the topic with Major Cui Fally, so he said directly, "By the way, what did you two come to me for?" Facing Lieutenant Colonel Redo's question, Major Cui Fally just smiled without blushing and said, "A few days ago, the special battalion that returned triumphantly from Bonifacio was temporarily stationed here. We just heard a rumor that General Paulie needs a special battalion to return to the support of the Northern Corps. Is that so?" "I did hear that the war in the north is a bit tight." Lieutenant Colonel Redo nodded in understanding, and then said, "Oh, I almost forgot. Both of you are still affiliated with the Special Mission Battalion, so are you here to report and say goodbye?" "That's right." Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set nodded in unison. "Okay, I see." Lieutenant Colonel Redo nodded indifferently, sat back in his chair, and looked down at the documents, and said casually, "Wait for General Paulie's official transfer order to come, and you can set off." Although Lieutenant Colonel Redo's words were equivalent to an order to leave, Major Trifoli still stood there, coughed twice and said, "Ahem. The transfer order is expected to come tomorrow, and by then we should leave in a hurry." "Huh? What do you want to say?" Lieutenant Colonel Redo looked up and asked in confusion. "Well, I was thinking, as the commander here, should you show up to say goodbye to the soldiers of the Special Mission Battalion? After all, they are still your soldiers. TSK." Lieutenant Colonel Redo glanced at the documents on the table with some displeasure, then frowned at Major Trifoli and said, "Why didn't I see you thinking this way before?" "Well, forget it. I'll show up. Don't delay me for too long." After that, Lieutenant Colonel Redo stood up impatiently, followed Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set out of the room, and walked to the camp of the Special Mission Battalion stationed for miles away. The weather in the Mediterranean at the end of March was still a little cool, accompanied by a strong evening breeze. Even the strong Lieutenant Colonel Redo couldn't help shivering. Due to the limited area of the Ajaccio garrison, the soldiers of the Special Mission Battalion had to sleep together on a flat ground for miles away from the garrison. The three of them walked silently through the path between the mountains and forests in the still bright moonlight. What surprised Lieutenant Colonel Redo was that Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set were silent all the way. Even if he occasionally threw out a few words, the two would just perfunctorily reply and then return to silence. "This damn weather is really uncomfortable." Lieutenant Colonel Redo, who was walking in the front row, sneezed and rubbed his nose and said, "How long have we been walking? Why haven't we arrived yet?" Major Trifoli poked Lieutenant Set silently, and the latter took out his pocket watch and looked at it in the moonlight for a while, and said, "It's been more than half an hour." "More than half an hour?" Lieutenant Colonel Redo was stunned for a moment, turned his head, and looked at Lieutenant Set and frowned, saying, "This section of the road will only take 20 minutes at most. What's going on?" However, when Lieutenant Colonel Redo turned his head, what he saw immediately made his back cold. He saw Major Trifoli standing still, facing him, and taking out his pistol expressionlessly, filling it with gunpowder and bullets. Lieutenant Colonel Redo thought that Major Trifoli had seen some wild beast, so he looked around vigilantly, but there was no wild beast or even a field mouse in the surrounding area. Trifoli said, "What are you doing?" Lieutenant Colonel Redo broke out in a cold sweat and shouted at the two men. However, the two ignored him. Lieutenant Set just whispered to Major Trifoli, "Can't we hear gunshots in the camp?" Major Trifoli continued to load the gun, shook his head and said, "It shouldn't be. The distance is far enough, and there are trees in the middle. Damn it." Lieutenant Colonel Redo wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and cursed. Read the correct version in the 1619 book forum. Although he had no idea why the major who had worked with him for several years did this, he turned around immediately and ran back when he saw Major Trifoli slowly pointing the muzzle of the pistol at him. Bang! With a dull gunshot, Lieutenant Colonel Redo, who had just run 2 steps, immediately felt a sharp pain in his leg, and then he lost his balance and fell to the ground, holding his thigh and wailing in pain. "Major, your aim is really good." Lieutenant Set turned his head and stared at Major Trifoli's pistol. "Nothing, the gun is just modified." Major Trifoli hung the pistol back on his waist and stared at Lieutenant Colonel Redo, who fell to the ground in a daze, looking at this comrade in arms and superior who had worked with him for nearly 10 years. "Lieutenant, do me a favor." Major Trifoli turned his back and didn't look at Lieutenant Colonel Redo's struggle. He said softly, "Give him a quick death." Lieutenant Set nodded heavily, drew his saber, and slowly walked towards Lieutenant Colonel Redo. Soon, in the whistling wind, Lieutenant Colonel Redo's painful wails could no longer be heard. Major Cui Farley leaned against a huge rock by the roadside, staring blankly at the bright moon above his head, wondering what he was thinking. "Major, it's done." Lieutenant Set wiped the blood off the blade with a handkerchief, walked to Major Trifoli and said, "In this way, as the second highest ranking officer in the Ajaccio garrison, you can temporarily take over the command after Lieutenant Colonel Redo disappears." "I know." Major Trifoli nodded slightly, turned his head to look at Lieutenant Colonel Redo, who was lying in a pool of blood and had no life left, and said slowly, "He was an outstanding soldier. He was a farmer before joining the army. He dedicated half his life to the independence and freedom of Corsica. The first time I saw him was on the battlefield. He carried me back to the camp when I was wounded under the Genoese artillery fire. Later we worked together in the Ajaccio garrison." Lieutenant Set sheathed his sword, closed his eyes, sighed, and said, "Do you regret it?" No. Major Trifoli shook his head firmly, looked at Lieutenant Set and said, "I know very well that in this revolution that concerns the survival of Corsica, the blood of innocent people will be shed. But it doesn't matter. You and I are not saints, and Lord Bonaparte is even less so. We can't take care of everyone, and if we stop moving forward because of this, I won't forgive myself." "You are right. Even Jesus can't take care of everyone." Lieutenant Seth nodded in approval. The two then remained silent for a while under the moonlight. "Lieutenant." Major Trifoli walked away from the boulder and said in a deep voice, "Go to the special camp and find 2 well-kept soldiers to bury Lieutenant Colonel Redo's body. After all this is over, I will personally bury him with the courtesy of a Corsican hero. After all this is over." Lieutenant Seth nodded and repeated, "To be exact, after the end of tomorrow." Major Trifoli looked up at the night sky and murmured, "Our mission has been completed, and the rest will be handed over to Lord Bonaparte." Chapter 110 Riot, Part 2. 1770. For most Corsicans who had just woken up from their sleep, this was just another ordinary day. The sun rose from the mountains in the east as usual, casting golden rays on Ajaccio, and the boundless blue sea remained unchanged. Even the city of Ajaccio seemed to have not changed at all compared to yesterday. At dawn, the governor's palace of Ajaccio. "Sorry to bother you." The secretary walked into Paola's study anxiously with a pile of schedules. After a slight bow, he handed the schedule to Paoli and said, "This is your schedule for today, and the bill of the parliament. Please confirm it." Although it was still dawn, Paoli, sitting behind his desk, did not look tired at all. His face was ruddy and full of energy, as energetic as if he had just drunk 2 glasses of brandy. Today, Paola's desk was rarely tidy. There was no document on it, not even the most basic quill pen and ink. Because soon, Paoli would no longer need these. Ah, thank you. Pauli took the schedule with a smile, humming an unknown cheerful tune, flipping through it casually. Oh, by the way, have all the arrangements I made been implemented? Pauli suddenly asked casually. All arrangements have been completed, except for one item. The secretary frowned and recalled for a moment, then said carefully, the arrangements for the security of the governor's palace seem to have not been completed yet. Security? Pauli's humming stopped abruptly, and he closed the schedule and threw it on the table, frowning and asking, what's the problem with security? As you requested, the National Defense Forces and the Ajaccio garrison will assist in security, but these soldiers have not arrived yet. The secretary also said a little strangely. The National Defense Forces garrison is less than an hour away from the governor's palace, and now it is more than an hour later than the scheduled time. This is really not right. Ajaccio garrison. It shouldn't be. Lieutenant Colonel Redo is a very loyal soldier. Pauli was surprised and muttered to himself, stroking his chin and considering various possibilities. However, he sat here and thought for a while without any result, so he ordered seriously, send someone to urge Lieutenant Colonel Redo immediately and make sure that all the soldiers are in place before the meeting of the parliament. Understood. At the same time, in a mansion at the outermost part of the East City district. Damn, the women in this city are just a little tender. Captain Hale woke up from the velvet bed, turned his head, and looked at his left, a naked, scarred, and still sleeping young girl, and pinched her directly, and said with a grin. The girl woke up from her sleep, and found that she was being hugged by the fat pig like Captain Hale. She immediately struggled in fear and resistance, trying to get up from the bed. Damn it, you bitch, you've been here for a few days, and you still don't know the rules. Captain Cale still grinned and mercilessly slapped the girl on the face, leaving a bright red palm print. Seeing the girl's eyes shed tears, Captain Cale lost interest, turned his head to look at the bed, and said to himself in confusion, strange, I remember I slept with 2 women last night, where did the other one go? Just as Captain Cale was puzzled, he saw his door slowly opened, and another half-dressed girl stared at Cale, and walked in gently. Before Captain Cale could speak, the girl's eyes had already pierced into Cale's face, and then she gasped and said, you villain who deserves to go to hell, devil. Your good days are over. After that, the girl picked up the vase hidden behind her back, and threw it at Cale with all her strength. Captain Cale's pupils shrank. Although he raised his arm to block the flying vase, the broken porcelain pieces still scratched his body. You Captain Cale stood up and roared, walking towards the girl like a mountain of flesh. You bitch, do you want to die? Cale grabbed the girl's neck with one hand and roared loudly. The strength of his hand continued to increase. Even after seeing the girl's face turn purple and blue, he still did not stop. At this moment, the door was suddenly pushed open again. Cale turned his head and saw that it was one of his servants who rushed in a panic. However, before he could scold him, the servant had already knelt on the ground with snot and tears on his face, handed a piece of inferior yellow-brown paper to Cale, and shouted, Master, it's bad. Take a look at this. Cale frowned, snorted coldly, threw the almost unconscious girl aside, took the paper and read it. Not only was the quality of the paper low, but the font printed on it was barely legible. It was obviously not produced by the Ajaccio printing factory, but rather a product of a small private workshop. However, when Cale struggled to identify the title at the top, he suddenly felt a chill on his back. It was written neatly, listing the 10 major crimes of Patrol Captain Cale. And at the back, all the atrocities Cale committed after arriving in Ajaccio were listed in dense small characters. In addition to the descriptive description, these words even included interviews with victims whose authenticity was unknown. Even Cale himself felt a strong emotional impact when reading them. Damn it, which bastard did this? Captain Cale angrily crumpled the paper into a ball, threw it on the ground, and shouted, Master, the servant kneeling on the ground cried and said, I don't know. Anyway, the streets outside are full of this stuff, and everyone has a copy. What did you say? Captain Cale was stunned for a moment, and cold sweat began to seep out of his forehead. The people are already gathering here, Master. What should we do? The servant asked loudly in collapse. Captain Cald gritted his teeth, turned around and rushed to the balcony on the second floor, carefully looking out at the situation on the street. He saw that the people had already found out his address and were now walking here in groups. Dozens of angry people had gathered at the gate and were fiercely confronting his servants. The people's long suppressed anger was finally ignited today by this widely circulated piece of paper. As for who made and spread this piece of paper, no one cared anymore. Look. On the second floor, that's the devil. Sure enough, he lives here. Smash him to death. In the few seconds that Cald stuck his head out to observe, a citizen recognized his fat head and big ears, and angrily picked up stones on the ground and threw them at Cald. Cald quickly retracted his head, ran downstairs in shock, and looked around for a place to hide. No, there is no place to hide. I will die if I stay here. A perfect version in 1619 book bar. Cald muttered to himself in fear, glanced at the courtyard behind the house, gritted his teeth, and said to the servants, "You all go to block the gate, don't let them in." After that, Cald ran into the courtyard, found 2 tables to use as tiptoes, and then with the help of 2 servants, he tried his best to climb over the wall to escape. As for the property in the house, compared with his own life, it was completely unimportant. On the other side of the wall was a road that was rarely visited. Usually, no one passed by here, and the angry citizens had not discovered this road for the time being. Captain Cald's fat body fell heavily from the wall. Although he felt his internal organs rolling, he was still very glad that he finally escaped death. However, Cald's happiness did not last long. On this road where no pedestrians usually passed, a carriage slowly drove over and stopped accurately in front of Captain Cald. Cald's mind was blank. He stared at the carriage in a daze, and the hair on his body stood up. In this situation, if he was discovered by any citizen, it would be equivalent to being sentenced to death. The door of the carriage was slowly opened, and then a young man wrapped in a linen cloak walked out. "Are you here to arrest me?" Cald sat on the ground with his whole body limp, and said weakly. The man chuckled, looked at Cald and said, "That's not the case. On the contrary, I'm here to save you." "Save me?" Captain Cald widened his eyes and said in disbelief, "Why did you save me?" The man looked around and said casually, "Well, for your money. This house is pretty good." "Okay, no problem, no problem." Cald stood up quickly and said excitedly, "I'll give it all to you. I'll give you everything. How are you going to save me?" The man pointed to the carriage behind him and said, "You hide in the car, and the driver will take you to a safe place to avoid the limelight." Cald nodded his head like a chicken pecking at rice, and said quickly, "Then I'll take you to the patrol station. I'm the captain of the patrol team. It's safe there." The man was stunned for a moment, then he couldn't help rolling his eyes and said, "Do you think those patrolmen are fools? Will they still protect you at this time?" "That's true." Cald's eyes dimmed a little, and then he said in a crying voice, "Sir, where is safe there?" The man smiled, pointed to the east and said, "Where do you think is the safest place in Ajaccio? You mean the governor's palace?" Cald suddenly realized and said excitedly, "Yes, that's right. As long as I enter the governor's palace, those untouchables will not dare to chase me in." The man smiled and nodded, patted Cald on the shoulder and said, "Get in the car." Cald quickly crawled into the car, but seeing that the man was still standing outside, he asked in confusion, "Sir, aren't you coming up? I still have things to do. As for my reward, I will ask you for it later." The man shook his head and said. After that, the man closed the door of the carriage, walked to the front, and whispered to the coachman, "Send him to the governor's palace." Just at the door, the coachman nodded respectfully and admiringly to the man, patted his chest and said, "Leave it to me, Lord Bonaparte." Thanks to the book friend a legendary pigeon for the reward and book friend 20200830172803189 for the monthly ticket support. Thank you very much. Chapter 111 Riot, Part 2. The commotion in Ajaccio continued. More and more citizens picked up the yellow-brown piece of paper from the ground, read Cald's crimes in anger and shock, and swarmed towards his house in pairs. The 3 streets around the house were already crowded with people. The angry citizens surrounded the house. Those who were close to it picked up objects nearby and threw them into the yard. Those who were farther away raised their arms and cursed Cald, who deserved to go to hell. The servants in the house were already scared out of their wits. They quickly carried out all the tables, chairs, and sofas in the house and blocked the door to try to stop the citizens from breaking in. However, such obstruction was completely futile. The citizens outside the door quickly found a log as thick as a man's waist, used it as a battering ram, and worked together to ram the iron gate again and again. Under such a collision, the thumb-thick iron chain that tied the gate also broke. After rubbing out several dazzling sparks, the angry citizens threw away the logs and poured into the mansion, starting to search everywhere for Cale's trace. Damn it, where did he go? No, we can't find him here. What about your place? We searched everywhere, but there's nothing. After turning the whole house upside down, the citizens did not find any trace of Cale, but in his room, they found the two girls who had been kidnapped and tortured for several days, which only added fuel to the citizens' anger. Seeing this, the citizens quickly turned their eyes to the servants, who had collapsed to their knees on the ground. Tell me, you lackeys, where is Cale? The pale servants had never seen such a scene before, and they hurriedly cried and stammered. The master ran away. He flipped out from the back and ran away. We don't know where he went. When the citizens heard this, they looked at each other in anger and gritted their teeth. They didn't expect that they were still a step too late and let the beast escape. Just when the citizens were a little confused, they heard someone in the crowd suddenly screaming, "I saw Cale on the road. He hid in the governor's mansion." The citizens turned their heads immediately, but did not find the speaker, but they had heard this sentence clearly in their ears. "I knew that Cale was appointed by Governor Pauly, so he must have gone there." That's right, he couldn't have escaped from East City, so he had to hide in the governor's mansion. Then we should. After the reminder from the voice, the citizens immediately realized that Cale couldn't have slipped out of East City under their noses, so the only possibility was the governor's mansion. Although in the minds of most citizens, the governor's mansion is a mysterious and solemn place, but now, looking at the piles of property in Cale's house and the two girls who were abused, people couldn't help but clench their fists. We can't stop here. This is the only thought of most citizens now. Friends, let's go to the governor's mansion to petition together, and Cale must be severely punished. As the leading citizen raised his arms and shouted, those citizens who were still a little hesitant also made up their minds and took steps to walk firmly towards the governor's mansion. Lawrence, who was hiding in the crowd, quietly retreated to the end of the team, rubbed his throat after screaming, and then turned into an alley without attracting anyone's attention. In the patrol station, after realizing that something was wrong, Old Scene immediately recalled all the patrol soldiers outside. Even Grosso and Jan, who were far away in the West City district, were notified by Old Scene to bring all the soldiers together and discuss the next countermeasures together. My god, the last time I saw such a scene was the siege of Zillow 2 years ago. Old Scene looked at the empty streets outside, knowing that most of the pedestrians had already run to the East City district, so he couldn't help but sigh. Grosso nodded, frowned slightly and said, "By the way, what about our fat pig captain? He is probably being hung up and beaten by the people now." Old Scene waved his hands with disgust and said, "I don't want to care about him. Just wait to collect his body." "Me too," Grosso said, moving his eyes to the pieces of paper that had been scattered all over the city, and asked in confusion, "Oh, by the way, who made this thing? Such a large number must have been planned for a long time." Before Old Scene could respond, a calm reply suddenly came from the gate of the garrison. "I planned it." A correct version in 1619 book and bar. Everyone looked at the door in surprise, and after looking carefully, they found that the person who spoke was Lawrence, who had not appeared in front of everyone for dozens of days. "Lord Bonaparte, when did you come back?" Old Scene stood up in surprise and rushed to Lawrence to greet him. Grosso was also very surprised to see Lawrence and the cloak in his hand. Then he suddenly realized and nodded and said, "So that's how it is. You have been back to Ajaccio for a long time. Did you plan all this today?" When Grosso saw that the people were mobilized so quickly, he vaguely realized that someone was behind this matter, but he never expected that this person would be Lawrence, who had disappeared from the public for dozens of days. Lawrence chuckled and nodded, then looked around at the fully armed and ready patrolmen. The patrolmen also stood in place, focusing hundreds of fanatical eyes on Lawrence. for them. There was only one commander from beginning to end, and that was Napoleon Bonaparte. Lawrence walked slowly past each patrolman, but did not speak. There was no need to encourage and mobilize these most loyal subordinates. Lawrence just made eye contact with them with a firm look. After experiencing the disgusting management of Hale during this period, these patrolmen also understood more clearly that they were not following the patrol captain, but only Napoleon Bonaparte himself. "Lawrence, what are you going to do?" Grosso stepped forward and whispered to Lawrence. He knew very well that Lawrence had carefully arranged such a big battle to turn Ajaccio, especially the East City district, into a mess. He must have other purposes. Jan and Oldstein also came up quickly, looking at Lawrence nervously and expectantly, waiting for his orders. Lawrence did not whisper back to the three people, but just nodded to them, then walked to the middle of the patrolmen, facing them, and ordered loudly like in the past days. "Everyone listen to the order. The riot in Ajaccio is moving towards the governor's palace. Our beloved Governor Paulie and the parliamentarians are in danger. Now everyone follow me to the governor's palace. Protect the governor and rescue the parliamentarians." Chapter 112. Marching into the governor's mansion. "We want to see the governor. Hand over Cald. He must be punished. Governor Paulie, did you hear our demands?" 500 meters away from the gate of the governor's palace, the citizens were blocked by the guards of the governor's palace. The two sides soon confronted each other on the spot. In just a few dozen minutes, both sides built their own positions with simple sandbags and wooden blocks, and neither side was willing to give in. For the citizens, they were in large numbers, and had already done this. Today, they had to wait for Paulie to come out in person, and bring the hateful Cald to justice. As for these guards, they knew that today was a grand event in the governor's palace. Not only were all 9 councillors present, but most of the celebrities and dignitaries in Ajaccio also gathered here, and were invited to attend the parliament. Even if they let a mob break into the governor's palace, the consequences would be something they could not afford, even if they lost their heads. Even so, the guards only held their muskets to intimidate the citizens, but they dared not load ammunition into the barrels. This situation was like a powder keg that could be ignited at any time. As long as the guards fired a gunshot, the citizens on the other side would definitely rush forward regardless of everything. Do you understand? You are not allowed to reload, but you can't let them go forward either. The captain of the guard shuttled among his own team in a panic, repeating the order loudly to the guards in person. Damn it, didn't they say that the National Defense Forces would assist us? Where are they? The captain gritted his teeth and looked at his team of only a few dozen people and shouted angrily to the adjutant. "I don't know about this. It should have arrived long ago." The adjutant took out a handkerchief, looked at the dark crowd opposite, kept wiping the cold sweat and said, "How about we go and ask Governor Paoli immediately?" After hearing this, the captain of the guard slapped the adjutant on the head mercilessly and cursed, "You idiot. Governor Paoli is in the parliament accompanying all the dignitaries of Ajaccio. You want us to interrupt the parliament with such a thing? Where is the governor's face?" But the adjutant looked like he was about to cry and muttered, "Once the mob breaks into the mansion, wouldn't it be even more?" The captain of the guard had an uncertain face. He frowned and glanced at the citizens opposite, gritted his teeth and said, "Wait a little longer. If it really doesn't work, ask Governor Paoli for instructions." Damn Halade, who let him in. The time soon came to 11 o'clock in the afternoon, and more than an hour had passed since the citizens gathered in front of the governor's palace. However, their enthusiasm and anger did not cool down at all. Instead, they became more violent because they had not received a response. Even their means of demonstration had evolved from shouting in unison at the beginning to throwing stones and empty bottles. Several guards were hit by flying objects and had blood on their heads because they did not dodge in time, but they did not dare to fight back at all. They still passively raised an empty gun and aimed at the opposite side. During this period, the captain of the guards also tried to shout to the citizens on the opposite side, but his hypocritical words without any sincerity did not appease the restless citizens at all, but made their throwing more violent. Damn it, where are the soldiers of the National Defense Force? Why haven't they come yet? The captain of the guards sat and leaned against the bunker, punched the ground heavily, and shouted in collapse. Without reinforcement, even if they got permission to open fire from Paulie, they could not stop these hundreds of citizens. The adjutant carefully poked his head out of the bunker to observe the situation. He seemed to have discovered something and stood there for a long time. He didn't retreat back into the bunker until he was almost hit on the head by a stone. "Here they come, sir, here they come." As soon as he retreated into the bunker, the adjutant shook the captain's shoulders like crazy and shouted excitedly. The captain of the guard pushed him away and asked in surprise, "The soldiers of the National Defense Force are here?" The adjutant was stunned for a moment, poked his head out again to take a look, then scratched his head and said, "No, they are not from the National Defense Force, but from the patrol team." Patrol? How could they be? With the arrival of the patrol, the citizens gradually stopped throwing stones and tacitly made way for the patrol to pass. Although Hailed had ruined the reputation of the patrol team during this period, these ordinary patrolmen were still absolutely positive in the eyes of the citizens. The captain of the guard stared at the patrolmen walking towards him, especially the appearance of the young man in the lead, which surprised him. "You Laurence Bonaparte? Why are you here?" Laurence smiled and saluted the captain of the guard, explaining, "I heard that there was a riot near the governor's palace, so I came here to support." "That's it." The captain of the guard glanced at the citizens who gradually calmed down and said gratefully, "Your arrival is too timely, Bonaparte." Sir." Halfway through his words, the captain remembered that Laurence had been dismissed from all his positions, so he had to address him awkwardly. Laurence nodded without any concern, turned around and walked to the middle of the confrontation between the two sides, raised his hands so that all citizens could see him. "That's Lord Bonaparte." Yes, it was him who came with the patrol. Wait, does that mean that Hailed is no longer the captain of the patrol? I don't know. Let's listen to what Lord Bonaparte is going to say. Amid the discussion of the citizens, Laurence spoke loudly. "My fellow citizens, I understand your thoughts. Hailed is a scumbag that I cannot describe in words. Anyone, as long as his blood is warm, will be angry at such a scumbag. But, friends, please do not let hatred and anger control yourself. I once promised you that I would carry out justice to the end, and now is no exception. So please let me represent your anger and hatred, and you, please remain rational and calm." Laurence's words floated into the hearts of the citizens like spring rain. People also knew that Lord Bonaparte's hatred for Hailed would not be lower than their own. Coupled with their trust in Laurence, a leading citizen came forward and said, "Lord Bonaparte, we believe in your promise. We are willing to retreat 1,000 yards and wait for your good news there. Check out the error-free version on the 16:9 book forum. Of course, thank you for your trust." Laurence nodded. Soon, under the leadership of the leader, most of the citizens took the initiative to distance themselves and gathered in the distance waiting for Laurence to bring out the evil Hailed. As for the few people who stayed in place, they quickly left under the drive of the guards. Although the threat of riots has not been completely eliminated, compared with the danger that was about to break out just now, the guards have breathed a sigh of relief. The captain of the guards looked at the messy scene with his eyes almost popping out. The big worry he had 10 minutes ago was completely resolved by Laurence with just a few words. "I really don't know how to repay you, Mr. Bonaparte." The captain of the guards excitedly shook Laurence's right hand and said repeatedly, "If there was a slight mistake in the face of this riot today, his head might be in danger." Now Laurence made a promise to these citizens, which was equivalent to taking the responsibility on his own initiative. "Actually, you do have a way to repay me." Laurence smiled and shook hands with the captain, saying with a smile, "Really? Please tell me." The captain of the guard said hurriedly, "Please order your men to disarm." "Ah, what?" The captain of the guard was stunned for a moment and asked blankly, "Please order your men to disarm. Mr. Bonaparte, what do you mean by this?" The captain of the guard immediately let go of Laurence's hand, stepped back several steps, and asked loudly and vigilantly. Laurence did not speak, but pointed behind him. The captain of the guard looked behind him, and was immediately frightened and sweated. He saw that the more than 100 patrolmen had gone around behind the guards at some point, and with loaded muskets, they had surrounded the guards of the governor's mansion in the middle. And these guards had been bluffing just now, and there was no ammunition in the gun chambers. "Laurence Bonaparte, what are you trying to do?" In the eyes of the captain of the guard, there were 4 or 5 black gun barrels pointed at him, so he couldn't help shouting at Lawrence in fear. "Do I need to repeat it again?" Lawrence said coldly with an expressionless face. "You." The captain of the guard looked around. The feeling of being pointed at by hundreds of muskets had made his legs a little weak. In addition, the number of people and fighter planes on his side were completely inferior, and there was no chance of resistance at all. "Everyone listen to the order. Put down your weapons, and don't resist." The captain of the guard squeezed out this order from his teeth in despair, and then took the lead himself, threw his pistol on the ground, and raised his hands high to surrender. The guards who gave up resistance were soon tied up, and guarded by some patrol men on the scene. As for the majority of soldiers led by Lawrence, they were already standing at the gate of the governor's mansion. This mansion, which has served as the center of power in Corsica since the Genoese period, now stands completely intact in front of Lawrence without any obstruction. Chapter 113 On behalf of all Corsicans, I disagree. Part 1. Thank you for your wonderful speech, Mr. Congressman. In the auditorium of the governor's palace, Corsican Bishop Eckable smiled and nodded to a congressman on the podium, then walked up to the podium calmly, faced the guests who filled the entire auditorium with a solemn expression, and continued to preside over the following agenda. Bishop Eckable has not changed much compared to 2 years ago. He is still the representative of the church in the parliament, and serves as the speaker of the Corsica parliament. But today, Bishop Eckable's dress is different from the past. He is seen holding a scepter, a white crown on his head, and even his robe is specially changed to a purple robe that highlights his bishop status. As for the reason why he is dressed so solemnly, you can understand it by looking at this full auditorium. Almost all the wealthy and famous people in Corsica were invited to attend this parliament. Without exception, they are all influential figures in their respective industries. From politicians, wealthy businessmen, and landlords at the top to craftsmen, fishermen, and shop owners at the bottom, representatives from all walks of life sat here. Even Lawrence's landlord and neighbor, Mrs. Duller, was invited because of her reputation in clothing art. The purpose of Paul's gathering these people here was also very clear. As long as he could win over or threaten these representatives in the parliament and make them accept the resolution of Corsica's annexation to England, then with their influence in their respective fields, this merger could be completed quite smoothly. The most prominent position in the entire auditorium, the front end of the horseshoe-shaped long table, was undoubtedly reserved for the 2 most distinguished people, Governor Pauly and Mr. Pitt. It was also the first time for Pitt to attend the parliament of another country. He was also very interested in the speeches of the parliamentarians and listened attentively. "To be honest, I quite like your parliament." After silently listening to the speech of the previous member of parliament, Pete leaned back in his chair and said to Paul casually, "It's just that the level is really too poor. Any passerby from Westminster in London can speak better than them. It's not their fault." Paul shrugged indifferently and said, "There are 2 country members who can't even recognize the alphabet. Every time we send them the minutes of the meeting, we have to send someone to read them to them." Pete couldn't help grinning and shook his head and said, "But you also have advantages. It's much more orderly here than the House of Commons in England. When I was Prime Minister, every time I went to the House of Commons to speak, the noise below was like a vegetable market, and I wanted to send the army to tie them all up." Paul just smiled and said nothing. "You know, the Corsica Parliament is as noisy as a vegetable market on weekdays. The reason why these members of parliament are so orderly today is because they know that the previous bills are insignificant and the highlight is still to come." After Pete finished speaking, he immediately laughed twice at himself, sighed and said, "But I haven't been to the House of Commons for 2 years. The House of Lords is full of a bunch of dopey old cucumbers and Alzheimer's patients, which is not as good as the House of Commons." Since being granted the noble status of Earl Tatham, Pete has lost the qualification to participate in activities in the House of Commons, and can only stay in the House of Lords to retire with other politicians who have lost power like him. Pauly smiled at Peter and said, "Maybe things will turn around after you return home this time. Who knows?" Haha. Pauly laughed twice, lowered his voice, and said slowly, "I'll go to London then, and I hope you can help me a lot." Peter put on an amusing expression, glanced at Paulie, and said vaguely, "Let's talk about it after we return home. Let's deal with the current things first." Compared with the orderly speeches of the parliamentarians in the front of the auditorium, the crowded representatives and guests in the back of the auditorium were much more lively, and the whispers of conversations were endless. For them, there are few such opportunities to gather representatives of various industries in one place, so many smart businessmen have begun to chat with people around them to expand their network. Even in these few hours, several business orders were negotiated on the spot in the back of the auditorium. But for most guests, the topic they discussed was undoubtedly today's unique parliament. Why did Governor Paulie summon them all here? I heard that there is something important to announce in this parliament. Is it important? What important? Did you see the man next to Governor Paulie? I heard that he is a British man. This matter should be related to Britain. The British are interesting. Do you know anything else? I don't have that ability. This rumor was just leaked 2 days ago. Time ticked by, and the hands of the big pendulum clock in the auditorium clearly pointed to 11 quarters. Paulie frowned and glanced at the congressman who was still speaking on the podium. He waved his hand slightly, and called his secretary, and whispered, "Tell all the congressmen and Bishop Eckable to speed up the process, otherwise it will be too late to hang the St. George flag on the governor's palace at 12 o'clock noon." "I understand." The secretary hesitated for a while before answering, and then looked at Paulie with a little dissatisfaction. He didn't expect that he had gone to such lengths to please Pete. A perfect version of the 16-9 book forum. Under Paulie's pressure, the remaining proposals were voted on without much discussion. The guests in the back also noticed this abnormality and stopped discussing. They stared at the front with full concentration. Some guests in the back seats even stood up and looked at Governor Paulie nervously. Finally, Bishop Eckable, who was standing on the podium, turned to the last page of the agenda. Although he had known about this proposal before the meeting, he couldn't help but confirm it on the stage for a while. Then, the last motion of the day. Bishop Eckable took a deep breath, slowly placed the agenda on the table, looked around at the parliamentarians and guests with a solemn expression, and said loudly, "It was submitted to the parliament by Governor Pasquale Paoli, whether to pass the treaty of merger between Corsica and England. The content of this treaty has been notified to the parliamentarians in advance, so I won't repeat it here." The shocked expression spread to every guest's face as Bishop Eckable's words, followed by a deathly silence. Even those who got some wind of the matter did not expect that the finale of this parliament would be such a shocking motion, and it was proposed by Governor Paoli himself. Although the guests did not know the specific amount of the treaty, they could tell from the name that Corsica would become the territory of the Kingdom of England. Ahem. Bishop Eckable cleared his throat, and he saw the shocked expressions of the representatives. When he learned the news himself, he had the same expression. Finally, it was His Excellency Peter who came forward to guarantee that the interests of the church in Corsica would not be harmed, which made Bishop Eckable agree to the treaty on behalf of the church. Then, please invite Governor Pasquale Paoli to come to the stage and explain his proposal. Bishop Eckable said, nodded to Governor Paoli, and gestured for him to come forward. Under the gaze of everyone, Paoli stood up, closed his eyes, and straightened his clothes, then turned around and bowed to the parliamentarians and guests, and then walked up to the podium. At this moment, everyone's heart was in their throat. Even the dullest people realized that the short few minutes now would determine the fate of the entire Corsica. Chapter 114 On behalf of all Corsicans, I disagree. Part 2. Good morning, members of parliament and delegates. Paulie leaned on the stage with both hands, fixed his eyes on the front, and said in a deep voice to the participants. Paulie had carefully planned for this scene for a long time, and he didn't need any script at all at this moment. He had rehearsed all the words in his mind countless times. For Paulie, this was his final performance. As you have heard, this treaty is about the annexation of Corsica to England. Paulie's eyes passed over the members of parliament in front of him. Anyway, they would support him anyway, so he stared at the representatives in the back row and said, the Kingdom of England is a great country, a vast, powerful, and wealthy country. When Paulie said this, his eyes were still secretly glancing at Mr. Pitt. When Corsica is incorporated into England, all of us will benefit from it. Just think about it. As long as the wealthy England tilts its purse slightly towards Corsica, the gold poured out will cover the entire island. England's merchant ships will bring shiploads of fine wine and treasures, and England's soldiers will protect us from the attacks of wolves and jackals around us. Paulie on the stage was still talking non-stop. From wealth to security, from freedom to rights. In Paula's words, England was described as a paradise on earth. At the same time, Paulie paused, his eyes became sharp, and his voice slightly raised the pitch, and he said loudly, if this treaty is passed by the parliament, then it will immediately have legal effect and take effect immediately. And in this process, if any Corsican citizen dares to obstruct the process of annexation, it is challenging the authority of the Corsican parliament. I believe you will understand the consequences of doing so. After Paulie finished his speech, he glanced at the guests who were still standing there, and then went straight off the stage, and returned to his seat. The representatives were stunned in their seats, thinking quickly about what Paulie had just said. At this time, some sharp representatives finally realized why Paulie had specially invited them to the parliament, which was to ensure that the entire merger process could proceed smoothly. At the same time, they also clearly read two meanings in Paula's words, winning over and threatening. Paulie returned to his seat and glanced at the big pendulum clock. Time was still a little tight, so he winked at Bishop Ekber. Bishop Ekber also nodded in understanding, walked up to the podium, and clapped his hands to signal everyone to be quiet, and then announced, since the parliamentarians have already known the content of the treaty in advance, there will be no more debate. Please ask the 9 parliamentarians to vote on this motion. When Bishop Ekber finished speaking, everyone, including Paulie and Pete, couldn't help holding their breath. Even though Paulie had already known that all the parliamentarians had turned to him, his heartbeat began to speed up at this moment. Peter licked his lips nervously. When the 9 councillors finished their performance like actors, his mission in Corsica was over. The representatives who were unaware of the situation were even more nervous. They looked at each councillor at the long table, expecting them to cast a solemn vote on their behalf. The echo of Bishop Ekber's voice was still echoing in the auditorium. The 9 councillors stood up silently and turned to face the representatives present. Why do I hear some noise outside? When the auditorium was completely quiet, Paulie could only vaguely hear a mess of footsteps outside the auditorium, and he muttered to himself in confusion. Is it hallucination? It's like this when you get old. Pettigrew smiled and shook his head after hearing Paula's muttering. That's possible. Paulie shook his head to throw these random thoughts out of his head, took a deep breath, and then nodded to Bishop Ekber, indicating that the vote could begin. I, Millers Becker, on behalf of the people of Ajacio's Eastern District, agree to the passage of the treaty. The first councillor stood solemnly, clenched his fist on his chest, and loudly announced his vote. Then the councillor behind him, I, Merrick Michel, on behalf of the people of Ajacio's Northern District, agree to the passage of the treaty. I, Brady Nicker, on behalf of the people of Ajacio's Southern District, agree to the passage of the treaty. I, Wes Mubarak, on behalf of the people of Ajacio's Western District, agree to the passage of the treaty. I, Carlo Bonaparte, on behalf of the people of Porto Vecchio, agree to the passage of the treaty. The councillors' loud voices were constantly reflected in the auditorium, forming waves of echoes. Until the last councillor finished voting, Paula's face finally relaxed. The big stone that was pressing on his heart had been removed by 99%. Most of the representatives in the back row sat there with pale faces. No one expected that this so-called vote would be so one-sided. For most people, being told so abruptly that they would become British was something they could not accept at all. However, the voting process was completed, and Paulie and Peter could not help but reveal a smile from the heart. Bishop Ekber on the podium was clearing his throat and preparing to announce the result of the vote. So, a perfect version in the 16:9 book forum. Bishop Ekber also calmed down his nervousness a little, and under the gaze of everyone, he said loudly, in the name of the Corsican Parliament, I declare that this treaty is passed. Wait. Just as Bishop Ekber announced slowly, there was a sudden explosion at the door of the auditorium, followed by a loud shout. This sudden change immediately attracted the attention of everyone present, and people looked at the door in a daze. This is the governor's palace. and the Corsican parliament is being held now. Who dares to do such a thing? The door of the auditorium was kicked open by someone, and it squeaked against the walls on both sides. Lawrence walked into the auditorium step by step, stood in the middle aisle, faced everyone's dull eyes, bowed slowly, and said, "I, Lawrence Bonaparte, on behalf of all the people of Corsica, do not agree to the passage of the treaty." The auditorium was dead silent. "Lawrence, you." Paulie stood up in a daze, his eyes tightly hooked on Lawrence. He didn't understand why Lawrence, who was supposed to stay in Florence, appeared here, why there were still fully armed patrols standing behind him after he was dismissed, why the guards at the door did not resist but followed Lawrence, and the patrols entered in a line. They quickly occupied every corner of the auditorium, like a big net surrounding the people present. Although the patrols just stood there, the swords on their waists and the muskets behind them had already been polished to a shine. Dear members of parliament and distinguished guests, Lawrence simply ignored Paulie and Pete, who were standing there in a daze, walked to the podium, pushed the dazed Bishop Echober aside, stood in front of the stage, and bowed to everyone, saying, "A terrible riot is taking place in Ajaccio. For your safety, I declare the parliament temporarily dissolved. The guests can leave under our protection. The rest of you, please move to a safe place under our protection." Thanks to the monthly ticket support from the book friend Shinio Fortune Telling. Thank you for your encouragement. Chapter 115. Remarks on the release. Originally, it was planned to be published on October 1st, but the editor notified me that it would be published this Friday, which is today, so it was published in a hurry. Then, this is the first time I have written this introduction. I heard that this introduction is used to sell misery. I really just heard it. But I thought about it, and I'm not a full-time writer. I'm not qualified to sell misery with the update of 4,000 to 5,000 words a day, so I will talk to you about this book. Objectively speaking, the performance of this book is quite poor, but it is much better than I expected. Of course, this is inseparable from the support of all the book friends. I'm very happy to see your comments, recommendation tickets, monthly tickets, and rewards in the background. I can even remember the IDs of many book friends who have been supporting me. My last book did not meet the contract standard, so it was abandoned at 110,000 words. Then this actually made me feel guilty, because there were several book friends who had been supporting and encouraging me at that time. I felt very sorry for them after I suddenly abandoned it, especially because there were still book friends who supported me after I abandoned it. I was really ashamed. After this experience, I also realized that the feeling of disappointing others' expectations is really painful, so in the book review section of this book, I made a promise that I would never give up and would do my best to meet everyone's expectations. At the same time, I also saw that more readers have expectations for this book this time, so for you, I also want to finish writing this book. Finally, I hope that everyone will support and subscribe more. Book friends who support the book can also support the First Order. Wow, thank you all on my knees. Thump. In addition, I wanted to update more during the period of listing, but the editor notified that the listing time was too hasty, so I didn't have any manuscripts on hand. But I still want to try to update more for everyone, so I have drunk a liter of coffee tonight and started to spit blood all night to write and do my best to update more for everyone. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 116. Please abdicate, Governor. The bright sun at noon shone through the windows of the auditorium, shining on Lawrence's back, forming a circle of blurred and hazy halo in everyone's eyes. Am I dreaming? Some guests murmured palely. From the time Paul announced the treaty to now, everything that has happened is like a bizarre dream that they can hardly accept. The congressmen in the front row were not much better than the representatives. They couldn't help but tremble all over, looking nervously at the fully armed patrolmen around them. In Lawrence's order just now, they didn't say that they could leave. Carlo, like other congressmen, stood by the long table and looked at Lawrence on the stage silently. Although he knew the inside story in advance and was not as panicked as other congressmen, Carlo's expression became complicated when he saw his brother standing on the stage and giving orders. 2 years ago, when Carlo wrote a letter to invite Lawrence to Ajaccio, he was still thinking of using his power to support his brother and keep him under his shadow. But now, Carlo looked at Lawrence absent-mindedly in the dazzling sunlight. He had understood that from now on, in Corsica, he would have to rely on Lawrence's protection. At this moment, this auditorium has become the center of the storm in Corsica. No representative would want to risk losing their heads and get involved in this change. So although the representatives did not react to the situation, after hearing Lawrence's promise to protect them from leaving the governor's palace, they stood up in a hurry one after another and ran towards the door without any regard for their manners. Some representatives sitting in the middle even overturned the benches and stepped out directly from them just to leave the auditorium faster. Paulie lay in the chair as if paralyzed, with almost no blood on his face, silently listening to the noise and shouts made by the representatives when they fled. After realizing that something was wrong, several of Pete's personal followers rushed up and surrounded Pete, protecting their master in the middle, staring at Lawrence in fear and anxiety. This is Governor Paoli. After instructing several patrolmen to escort the representatives away, Old Scene walked to Lawrence, stared at Paoli in front of him timidly, and whispered, "This is the first time I have seen him so close." For an old man like Old Scene who has experienced the entire Corsica Republic from its establishment to the present, Pasquale Paoli is undoubtedly a well-known name. Now that he is actually surrounded by this legendary figure here with weapons, Old Scene has a sense of unreality. Grosso has the same feeling as Old Scene, but the object of his attention is William Pitt on the side. Grosso never thought that he would be able to stand on the stage and look down on such a big man one day. Of course, the two of them also understand who is the person who allows them to do this. Lord Bonaparte. The guests have all been evacuated. Old Scene saluted Lawrence in a somewhat awkward manner. Being in this governor's palace auditorium that he had never dared to think of before, Old Scene's behavior could not help but be much more respectful. The guests in the back row had all left, leaving only rows of crooked benches in the original place. The huge auditorium fell silent again. The congressman had already been frightened and pale, and kept recalling whether they had done anything to contradict Lawrence, or whether there was any bargaining chip that could bribe Lawrence to let them go. As for Paulie, who was at the front of the long table and directly facing Lawrence, he kept his eyes closed and said nothing, as if he did not belong to this world. Pete stared at Lawrence in silence. It was not until this time that he realized that his understanding of this young man in the past month was completely wrong. He was not a lamb that could be controlled by himself. When he took off his gentle skin and showed his terrifying fangs, Pete realized that it was too late. Lawrence nodded to Old Scene and said, "Take people to find Caled. Don't report to me when you find him. Just throw him to the citizens outside." Yes. Old Scene felt a chill on his back after receiving the order. He saw the huge crowds of angry citizens on the way here. After throwing Caled in, it is estimated that there would not be even a bone left. After hearing Lawrence's order, Paula's eyelids trembled slightly, and then he sighed inaudibly, slowly opened his eyes, and looked at Lawrence, but his eyes were already turbid, without a trace of spirit. "Head, is this what the riot you just said was about?" Paula's voice suddenly became old, as if 10 years of his life had passed in just a few minutes. Lawrence glanced at Paulie expressionlessly and nodded slightly. "That's right. That's right. If I had attacked Caled at that time." Paulie, with bags under his eyes, kept muttering and chuckled at himself from time to time, said, "That won't work either. You can always find a reason to break in here." After that, Paulie grabbed the armrest of the chair again, turned sideways with difficulty, looked around at the patrolmen around him, grinned miserably, and said, "The correct version is in the 1619 book bar. Look at these guys. I don't know what kind of witchcraft you used on them to make them take such a risk to follow you. You have been dismissed." "Alright, Governor Paulie." Lawrence waved his hand to interrupt Paula's endless chatter and said coldly, "Since you said so, you admit that you are responsible for the crimes committed by Caled, right?" Paulie and the parliamentarians present could not help but be stunned for a moment. in the past, which Corsican dared to point at Paulie and ask him for punishment. But when they saw the patrol soldiers surrounding them, they immediately recognized the reality and sighed in their hearts. The sky in Corsica has indeed changed. Paulie lay in the chair in silence for a long time before he recovered from the huge gap. Then he adjusted his mood a little, sat upright and looked at Lawrence and said, "What do you want to say, Lawrence?" Although he had been directly ordered by Lawrence, Paulie still knew that he still had the biggest bargaining chip in his hand. That is, at this moment, the supreme leader of Corsica was still him, Pasquale Paulie. Lawrence saw that Paulie had regained his spirits and knew that he wanted to negotiate with him formally, so he said, "Even as the governor, you must bear the corresponding responsibility and guilt in this riot." "Really? Tell me, what responsibility do I have to bear?" Paulie stared at Lawrence and asked without any polite cover-up. The empty auditorium echoed with the exchange of words between the two people. The others, including Serpent, listened attentively with bated breath, silently watching the two people representing the old and new Corsica respectively. During your time as governor, you made an unforgivable mistake in decision making, which brought incalculable losses to the Corsicans and directly caused today's riot. Therefore, in order to calm the public anger and express your apology, Lawrence placed his hands on the podium, looked down at Paulie, and said in a deep voice, "Please abdicate, Governor." Chapter 117 Governor Bonaparte. "Please abdicate, Governor." Lawrence's words echoed in everyone's ears, like a spell that froze the time in the auditorium for several seconds. The congressmen were already standing there with their minds blank. In their opinion, these words could not form a sentence in the Corsican dictionary. Old Scene, Grosso and Jan couldn't help but open their mouths and turn their heads to stare at Lawrence. Even though they knew Lawrence's purpose long ago, when Lawrence really said this to Paulie, their hearts still beat faster. Even William Pitt couldn't help but look up at Lawrence, and he raised his opinion of this young man. Abdicate. Paulie's face did not show any shock or anger. He was no longer the governor who held Lawrence in his hands and held great power. All he could do was to rely on his current status to find a way out for himself. "I think I should have the right to refuse." Paulie raised his eyebrows and said to Lawrence. Peter nodded slightly after hearing this, knowing that Paulie was testing Lawrence's bottom line. Lawrence knew this very well, sneered, and said directly, "Of course you can refuse, but..." Lawrence suddenly stopped talking halfway, then took off the short knife with the blade and sheath on his waist and slammed it heavily on the table, making a dull sound. "In that case, after transferring you outside the governor's mansion, I can't guarantee your safety." With the oscillating echo, Lawrence touched the sheath on the table and added slowly, "After you leave the governor's mansion, the living conditions are naturally not very good. If a Genoese assassin or a Corsican mob breaks into the house, it is also normal." Although Lawrence's tone was very calm, it still made the congressman and Paulie present shudder. Threat, naked threat, and the most direct threat of life. However, the most direct means is also the most effective. Paulie's pupils shrank noticeably. He had never expected that Lawrence would tear his face off directly. In the blink of an eye, he had already placed the blade in front of him. "Lawrence, you..." Paulie frowned, stared at Lawrence, and said harshly, "You do this. Don't you care how the people of Corsica will evaluate you?" The reason why Paulie had the confidence to say this was because he was the founder of the Republic of Corsica after all. Although he had attracted a lot of criticism, he still had a good status in the hearts of the people. But Lawrence looked down at Paulie, first nodded slowly, then shook his head slowly, and said threateningly, "Of course I care, but, after you die, will the people still support you so much?" Paulie was stunned for a moment, and asked subconsciously, "What do you mean?" "When you lie in the coffin, no matter how magnificent your life is, it is just a blank canvas in my eyes." Lawrence walked down the podium slowly, stood in front of Paulie, and said in a cold voice, "Some of your negative letters, speeches, and behaviors will be mentioned repeatedly, and these may not even be true. It won't be long before the people will find out that the Governor Paulie, whom they once supported, is such a bad person. As for you, a dead man lying in a coffin, how can you defend yourself? You..." Paulie's eyes widened even more. He wanted to use his fame to threaten Lawrence to make concessions, but he never expected that Lawrence would directly threaten him to compromise. and Paul knew that what Lawrence said was right. The evaluation of a dead person could be arbitrarily changed by the living. If such a situation really happened, Paul would not only lose his power during his lifetime, but also his reputation after his death. With Paul's defeat in this round of confrontation, he also completely understood that his so-called bargaining chips and trump cards were completely useless in the current situation. From the moment Lawrence broke into the parliament, he did not intend to give himself any room for maneuver. Governor, the parliamentarians could not help but show an incredible expression, watching the governor Paul, who they thought was all-powerful, gradually lower his head under Lawrence's words and remain silent. After a long time, Paul raised his head again. His face was completely pale and said to Lawrence, "I understand." After Paul was forced to accept Lawrence's request to abdicate, the two of them went to Paul's study to get the blank order documents, and the rest of them continued to stay in the auditorium. Paulie sat behind the desk as usual, found a blank document from the drawer, picked up a quill pen, and began to slowly write his abdication announcement. At the same time, he also knew that everything he did in this study would be the last time. "I admit that I underestimated you." Paulie buried his head in writing and said to Lawrence casually, "When did you return to Ajaccio from Florence?" Lawrence stared at the tip of Paulie's pen and shook his head and said, "I didn't go to Florence." Huh. Paulie couldn't help but stop the movement of his hand, frowned and asked, "Impossible. The report I received said that you boarded a merchant ship bound for Florence. A correct version in 1619 book bar. The captain was bribed and sent me to Toulon." Toulon. Paulie couldn't help but open his mouth, lost for a moment, and slowly said, "So, you went to find the French?" "That's right." Lawrence nodded in acknowledgement, and then directly informed Paulie of his contract with the Duke of Choiseul. After listening to Lawrence's plan, Paulie's expression was dull for a long time before he recovered, and then he suddenly laughed out loud twice. "What are you laughing at?" Lawrence frowned and asked. He could tell that Paulie's laughter was obviously self-deprecating. Paulie held his forehead, grinned, paused and said, "Our Corsican leaders are also quite interesting. I want to sell the sovereignty of Corsica to the British, and you directly make Corsica into a crown and put it on the head of the French. This is only temporary." Lawrence shook his head and said, "Temporary?" Paulie was stunned and asked in confusion. "The crown I gave to the French personally, I will also take it back personally." Paulie raised his head and stared straight into Lawrence's eyes, but he did not see a trace of confusion in these eyes. "Oh, Lawrence, I knew it." Paulie suddenly smiled with relief, handed the written document to Lawrence for a view, and then shook his head and said, "You are a born rebel. You will definitely stab Louis XV in the back, like you betrayed me." Lawrence did not speak, but took Paulie's document and began to review it. Seeing that Lawrence did not reply, Paulie continued to speak to himself. "However, since you told me so much, that is to say." After Lawrence confirmed that the document was correct, he stood up directly, looked at Paulie and said, "I will let you live comfortably, but that's all." Paulie saw that Lawrence decided his fate in one sentence, and couldn't help but bow his head and smile bitterly. He already knew that he should spend the rest of his life under house arrest, so he said calmly, "So, from now on, should I call you Governor Bonaparte?" "If you like." Chapter 118, Parliament's Obedience. Mr. Bonaparte. When Lawrence and Paulie returned to the auditorium again, Bishop Eckable took the initiative to greet him, with a flattering smile on his face, bowing to Lawrence and saying, "It's an honor to see you again. The last time, which was also the first time we met, was 2 years ago." Lawrence looked at Bishop Eckable, who was dressed in a gorgeous outfit, and remembered that this was the Corsican bishop who served as the Speaker of the Parliament. Lawrence had only seen him when he first followed Paulie to attend the Parliament. Bishop Eckable did not come forward to welcome Lawrence alone. Behind him, there were 9 parliamentarians standing neatly. They also bowed slightly to Lawrence and lowered their heads to show their obedience. Paulie, who was standing behind Lawrence, watched these people coldly show their courtesy to the new owner of the governor's palace, while just an hour ago, the object of their courtesy was still him. "You are Bishop Eckobay, right? I have heard of you, a faithful servant of God and a learned bishop," Lawrence said with a polite smile, while reaching out to help Bishop Eckobay up. Lawrence also performed basic etiquette for this representative of the church. After all, in the subsequent plan, Bishop Eckobay is an indispensable figure. So, what are you doing? Lawrence glanced at the parliamentarians behind Bishop Eckobay and asked. Ahem. Bishop Eckobay cleared his throat, took out a thick roll of parchment from his robe, and handed it to Lawrence, and explained. Just now, after you and Mr. Pawley left, the parliament discovered a problem. That is, after Mr. Pawley suddenly resigned, the position of governor will be vacant. Lawrence frowned slightly after hearing this, although any discerning person could see that Lawrence was already the new owner of the governor's mansion. But legally speaking, the normal replacement of the governor requires a large-scale election to decide, and Lawrence obviously does not have so much time to hold and manipulate an election at this moment. However, Lawrence glanced at Bishop Eckobay in front of him, and the parchment in his hand, that had not been opened yet, and he also understood that the bishop and the parliamentarians must have solved this problem, so they specifically mentioned this matter in front of him. So he followed his words and said, well, this is indeed a problem. The country cannot fall into a state of chaos without a leader. After hearing this, Bishop Eckobay smiled even more, and hurriedly helped Lawrence spread out the parchment roll in his hand, explaining, however, just now, there was an extremely smart parliamentarian, actually your brother, Parliamentarian Carlo, who discovered a provision in a corner of the Corsica constitution. Lawrence looked at the parchment in his hand. The ink on it was not completely dry, and it was obviously just written. As for the content, it was probably that the Corsican parliament cited a clause in the Corsican constitution. In the event of an emergency, when the governor was vacant, the parliament had the power to directly vote to select a new governor. As for who the new governor was, it was self-evident to everyone. At the signature section, the signatures of the 9 members were all lined up on it, indicating that they all agreed that the parliament would use this power. However, these signatures were written bigger than each other, as if they were afraid that Lawrence would not notice them. Lawrence glanced at the parchment and exchanged a grateful look with Carlo. It was also thanks to his lawyer brother that he made it much easier for him to solve the legitimacy problem. Looking at the submissive Bishop Eckobay and other members in front of him, it was obvious what they wanted to express, which was to present the legal basis for Lawrence to serve as governor as a gift. Lawrence nodded with satisfaction and said with a smile, yes, it seems that the Corsican parliamentarians are still capable. Hearing this, Bishop Eckobay and the parliamentarians behind him finally breathed a sigh of relief. Since Lawrence accepted this gift, it meant that their lives and status were temporarily safe. As for Lawrence, the reason why he now took a lenient attitude towards these parliamentarians was that he really needed these parliamentarians to recognize the legitimacy of his position as governor. But more importantly, what Lawrence launched was an armed coup after all. He just replaced the top of the Corsica power system from Pawley to himself. As for other people in the power system, including these parliamentarians, they were all Pawley's party members before. If Lawrence took tough measures against them, as soon as he came to power, it would inevitably cause chaos in Corsica. In addition, Lawrence did not have enough and suitable candidates around him to replace them, so when Lawrence saw these parliamentarians eagerly and terrified to offer this gift, he also accepted it with a smile. We still have to wait until everything is settled before replacing these people with our own people. Lawrence looked at the parchment, occasionally glancing at the parliamentarians in front of him, and secretly made up his mind. Ahem. Bishop Eckobay straightened his clothes, put on a solemn expression, looked at Lawrence and said, Mr. Bonaparte, do you accept the appointment of the parliament? I accept. Lawrence nodded. Read the correct version in 1619 book bar. After hearing this, Bishop Eckobay straightened his hunched back and looked into Lawrence's eyes. Even though there were only a few people present, he still spoke in a solemn and loud voice like a church choir. Then, as the president of the Corsica Parliament, on behalf of all the members, in the name of the Corsica Parliament, I formally grant you the authority of the governor of Corsica. Finally, as Bishop Eckobay's voice fell, everyone present understood that, both in fact and in law, the young man in front of them had reached the pinnacle of power in Corsica. Corsica, a small island in the western Mediterranean, has welcomed a brand new leader from this moment on. As for Pawley, who was standing behind the new governor, his figure looked much more desolate. In order to distance themselves from Paulie, the members of parliament directly treated him as a ball of air and did not even dare to look at Paulie. Paulie no longer cared about these things. He witnessed Lawrence taking over the power of Corsica with an expressionless face, and also witnessed the end of his era in Corsica. Grosso, who was not far away, stared at Lawrence closely. His eyes were full of passion, and he couldn't help but mutter to himself, sure enough, it was a good bet to follow this kid. Even the patrolmen on duty in the auditorium couldn't help but cast their fanatical eyes on Lawrence, and they were more determined to follow Lord Bonaparte. Bishop Eckable looked at Lawrence respectfully, and once again, he led the 9 councillors to bow deeply to him, and said in a deep voice, God bless you, and may all the people of Corsica follow your glory, Governor Bonaparte. Chapter 119 The British Strikes Back. 1770. 2 hours had passed since Lawrence launched the coup. After Lawrence successfully obtained the legal basis for the succession of the governor from the parliament, the next thing to do was to restore order in the governor's mansion. After all, Lawrence did not want to take over a chaotic Corsica. For the parliamentarians except Carlo, although they had expressed their submission to him, Lawrence temporarily placed them under house arrest in the governor's mansion to avoid unnecessary trouble. Because Lawrence also knew that what really made the parliamentarians surrender was the swords in the hands of the patrolmen. Once they were allowed to leave the governor's mansion, who knew whether they would tear off the disguise of obedience and plan some conspiracies and tricks, while Lawrence had just come to power and had an unstable foundation. As for Paulie, Lawrence also placed him under house arrest in the mansion. Although the founder of the Republic of Corsica had lost all his power, for Lawrence, he could still serve as a symbolic mascot to enhance the legitimacy of his succession as governor. However, among all the people in the auditorium, the one who gave Lawrence the most headache was William Pitt, who had said almost nothing from beginning to end. The former Prime Minister of the Kingdom of England, the Honourable Earl of Tatham, was the only one that Lawrence could not force with force, unless Corsica was ready to go to war with England. Of course, this did not mean that Lawrence was ready to release Pitt directly. After all, he was a hostage of great value. Therefore, Lawrence still placed Pitt in his house in the governor's palace, and sent people to guard him strictly, preparing to turn him into a political bargaining chip in the future. When the order in the governor's palace was gradually restored, there was also an uproar in Ajaccio. Governor Paoli resigned, and Lawrence Bonaparte was appointed as the new governor by the parliament. This news instantly ignited the whole of Ajaccio, and the streets and alleys in the city were full of discussions on this topic. If it weren't for the patrolmen under Lawrence, who announced this fact to the citizens in person, no one would take this fantastic news seriously, and would only regard it as some idiot having a sudden hysteria. Oh my god, Governor Paulie would suddenly resign. Have you seen the notice posted by those patrolmen? It said that Governor Paulie resigned because of the Caled incident. Alas, the Caled incident was indeed Governor Paulie's fault. It is said that Caled was beaten to death in the blink of an eye after being thrown out of the governor's mansion. But it is Lord Bonaparte who will replace Governor Paulie. This makes sense. Although Lord Bonaparte is young, his ability is unquestionable. The civilians whispered to each other on the street. Although they all showed shocked expressions after hearing the news, after thinking about it carefully, they did not think it was a negative change. In the eyes of ordinary citizens, with Lawrence's prestige and ability, he would sooner or later take the position of governor. Now it is just bringing this time forward. Even in the eyes of some young Corsicans, Paulie, who has lived in the palace for a long time, is like a stranger to them. On the contrary, Lawrence, who is close to the people, can win their support. Although a small number of citizens have questioned Lawrence's qualifications and abilities, for the vast majority of citizens, Lawrence's rise to power has not made them pessimistic. However, not all forces in Ajaccio welcome Lawrence's rise to power. At this moment, the Reasonable is moored at the dock in the port of Ajaccio. Alas, I don't know how Sir Pitt is doing. In the captain's cabin, Captain Morris was lying bored in an oak chair, looking at Ajaccio through the porthole, quietly waiting for news from Sir Pitt. As long as this treaty is successfully passed by the Corsican Parliament, Sir Pitt's mission will be accomplished, and he can finally leave this remote place. It's really strange. Captain Morris, who had been waiting for a long time, took out his pocket watch to check the time. It was already 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The parliament should have ended 3 hours ago, but he had not received any news from Sir Pitt. Is Sir Pitt drunk at the banquet? Captain Morris scratched his head, stood up from his chair in confusion, pushed open the hatch, and walked to the deck to get some fresh air. When the sailors saw Captain Morris coming to the deck, they also hurriedly stopped their work and saluted Captain Morris according to military regulations. They continued their work after getting Morris's nod of permission. Captain Morris stretched his waist and lay on the side of the ship casually looking at the dock below. However, after just looking for a while, the alert Captain Morris soon discovered something strange on the dock. The dock workers, who were busy with work on weekdays, did not show any anxiety at this moment. Even though there were piles of goods waiting to be moved on the dock, they gathered in groups of 3 or 5, as if nothing had happened, standing on the dock and discussing something loudly. It seemed that what they were discussing was much more important than the unfinished work. Just when Captain Morris was somewhat puzzled by the strangeness in front of him, he heard a hurried voice behind him. Report. Captain Morris. There seems to be something going on in Ajaccio. Captain Morris turned his head and saw a sailor who had just returned from the dock. He stood at attention and looked very panicked. What's going on? Captain Morris frowned and asked, and suddenly thought of Mr. Pitt, who had no news so far, and immediately had a bad premonition. I just asked the workers on the dock. Read the correct version in 1619 book bar. The sailor's face was very ugly. After a simple salute to Captain Morris, he said directly, it is said that just now, Governor Pauly of Corsica resigned and was replaced by a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. Governor Pauly resigned? Captain Morris looked at the sailor in disbelief, confirmed with him again that he was not wrong, and then couldn't help patting his forehead. Captain Morris would never believe that Pasquale Pauly would resign. Pauly was only half a step away from the title he had always dreamed of. How could he resign at this critical juncture? Exclamation mark. Captain Morris thought of this and bit his lip tightly. He was completely sure that this was a sudden coup. Damn it. Captain Morris suddenly cursed and punched the side of the ship. Captain Morris didn't care whether the treaty between Pitt and Pauly was successfully passed. He only cared about the safety of Sir Pitt. As the highest ranking officer on this visit to Corsica, he was directly responsible for the personal safety of William Pitt. Once a big man like Sir Pitt had any mishap in Corsica, Captain Morris would inevitably be tried by the military court after returning home. Thinking of this, Captain Morris could not calm down immediately, and his mind was rapidly planning how to rescue Sir Pitt. Negotiate with that Bonaparte? Impossible. As a captain, I'm not qualified to negotiate with him on behalf of England, or pay a ransom. It won't work. Even if I sell the reasonable, I can't redeem Sir Pitt. After rejecting several ideas in succession, Captain Morris also knew that there was only one most radical plan left for him. Captain Morris took out the assembly whistle and put it in his mouth and blew all the air in his lungs into the whistle with all his strength, and immediately a loud and piercing whistle sounded. All the sailors who heard the whistle hurriedly dropped their work, even the related Nelson, and hurried to the upper deck to assemble as quickly as possible. Captain Morris looked at the neatly arranged sailors in front of him with a stern face and said directly in a loud voice, "Our beloved Sir Pitt was attacked by a despicable usurper when he was attending the parliament with Governor Pauly. Now Sir Pitt's life or death is uncertain, which is a great humiliation to the Kingdom of England and our Royal Navy. Therefore, I order all sailors to attack the governor's palace in Ajaccio, search for Sir Pitt, and wash away our shame with the blood of Corsicans." Thanks to the book friend Luo Shubinu for the reward support. Thanks to the book friends Bing ZHAK, Fusheng Banshee 66, Old Man Dare to be Presumptuous here, Luo Shubinu, Feng Ling UXIU, and Stony Nicholas for their monthly ticket support. Thank you very much. Chapter 120 Reinforcement. In the governor's mansion, the study room that originally belonged to Pauly now has a new owner. Lawrence sat behind the desk calmly, not feeling any strangeness because of the sudden change of identity. As for the two people in front of Lawrence, they were Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set, who had just arrived from the Ajaccio garrison. "Governor Bonaparte, reporting to you." Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set saluted Lawrence excitedly. When they received Lawrence's summons in the camp, the two finally put down their hanging hearts, knowing that the Lord Bonaparte they followed had already entered the governor's mansion. Along with Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set came more than 600 soldiers in the camp, including the National Defense Force in the Ajaccio garrison and the soldiers of the Special Battalion that Lawrence brought back from Bonifacio. Lawrence knew very well that the more than 100 patrolmen under his command were enough to raid the governor's palace, but they were not enough to deter the possible riots in Ajaccio. Therefore, after Lawrence dealt with the affairs in the auditorium, he immediately ordered Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set to lead troops into the city to prevent the unrest. Oh my god, Lieutenant Colonel Bonaparte, oh no, I mean Governor Bonaparte. Even though Major Trifoli was already standing in front of Lawrence, he had not recovered from the excitement of receiving the news. He patted his chest and said repeatedly, I can't believe that you actually did it. Lieutenant Set on the side also nodded excitedly and agreed. It's a pity that I didn't witness the moment you took office with my own eyes. Listening to the congratulations of the two, Lawrence just smiled bitterly and shook his head. While taking over the power of Corsica, he also shouldered the responsibility for the people of the entire island. Lawrence also felt heavy pressure when he thought of being watched by thousands of eyes. After congratulating Lawrence, Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set regained their serious expressions. They knew that, although they had successfully overthrown Paulie, they still had a lot of messes to clean up. By the way, Governor Bonaparte, the soldiers in the camp, except for the wounded, have arrived in Ajaccio with us. Major Trifoli reported to Lawrence, and suddenly asked in confusion, why do you want me to bring all the soldiers to the city? In order to maintain order, the soldiers of the Special Battalion alone are enough, right? Lieutenant Set also looked at Lawrence in confusion. In their opinion, except for the soldiers of the Special Battalion who were absolutely loyal, the rest of the Wehrmacht soldiers were forced to obey the command of Major Trifoli, just because of the disappearance of Lieutenant Colonel Redu. If Lawrence had not personally ordered such an unstable force to enter Ajaccio, Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set would never have carried out the order. Facing their questions, Lawrence calmly explained, now that Paulie has stepped down, the possibility of their rebellion is minimal. But, Major Trifoli still said worriedly, Paulie is still alive after all, and some officers with ulterior motives may. Lawrence still shook his head. He had already considered this possibility, so he said, it is indeed possible, but compared to me, these soldiers have a bigger enemy at the moment. Enemy? What enemy? Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set both blurted out in surprise and confusion. They could not think of any enemy in Ajaccio that required all the soldiers to deal with. When Lawrence opened his mouth to explain, he saw the door of the study suddenly pushed open. Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set quickly turned their heads and saw that the person who came was a sturdy man with a scar on his face, and it was Grosso, Lawrence's subordinate. When Lawrence saw Grosso suddenly barge in, his face suddenly became serious. He didn't care about his impolite behavior and asked hurriedly, Grosso, you are here. Is there any movement over there? Grosso nodded with a heavy expression and said, they are already gathering. Lawrence, you guessed it right. Really? Lawrence touched his chin and nodded, waved to Grosso and said, take your people to observe, and send someone to report immediately if there is any change. Okay, I understand. After leaving this sentence, Grosso ran out without even closing the door. This. Major Trifoli and Lieutenant Set looked at each other in bewilderment, not knowing what had happened, so they asked anxiously, Governor Bonaparte, what's this? Lawrence rested his hands on the table and dragged his chin, explaining calmly, that was my man just now. He was ordered to monitor the British warship anchored in the port. Now the sailors on the warship have assembled. If nothing unexpected happens, their target is the governor's mansion. When Lawrence was considering how to deal with William Pitt, he thought of Captain Morris's revenge, so he sent Grosso to observe the movement in the port with a telescope outside the governor's mansion on higher ground. And the two finally understood, while Lawrence had transferred all the soldiers into the city. It turned out that Lawrence had anticipated the actions of the British sailors. But, Governor Bonaparte, Major Trifoli touched his chin, his eyebrows full of anxiety, and then hesitantly said, if it were those sailors, our troops would not even be able to resist their attack. Major Trifoli said this after careful consideration. As a third-class ship, the Reasonable usually carries between 450 and 600 sailors. Although the number of sailors seems to be slightly inferior to that of the Corsican army, don't forget that in a street battle in a city like Ajaccio, it is these sailors with stronger individual qualities who have the advantage. In the 16-9 book, the correct version. In the intricate streets, the line soldiers of the Corsican army can easily be approached by the British sailors from the flank or behind, and forced into hand-to-hand combat, which they are not good at. Governor Bonaparte, I have no intention of surrendering without a fight, but, Major Trifoli carefully observed Clarence's expression, gritted his teeth and said, facing these sailors, even if we win, it will definitely be a miserable victory. Anyway, they are definitely here for that beat, so we might as well hand him over voluntarily. Lieutenant Seth also looked at Clarence's face uneasily, fearing that Clarence would regard Major Trifoli's words as an act of boosting others' prestige and destroying his own morale. However, Clarence just shook his head calmly after hearing this. He also knew that Major Trifoli made a rational judgment after thinking about it, so he said patiently, no, if we take the initiative to make concessions, it will only make Morris more convinced that Ajaccio is not well defended. And when Pitt returns to Morris, he will definitely ask him to directly attack the governor's palace and re-establish Paulie as governor. That's true. I'm sorry, Governor Bonaparte, I miscalculated. Major Trifoli thought for a moment, then bowed and apologized, saying, in that case, we have to start deploying the soldiers immediately. The sailors on the Reasonable have assembled. It is only an hour's journey from the West City port to the governor's palace. There is really not much time left for the Corsican army. Clarence also nodded to acknowledge the urgency of time, but he did not immediately let the two of them lead the army. Instead, he suddenly said to Major Cui Fally, by the way, Major Cui Fally, that troop should have entered the city with you, right? Major Cui Fally was stunned for a moment before reacting. That troop? You mean, the cuirassiers? Yes, I want to see their captain. Clarence nodded and said, they did enter the city with us, but, Major Cui Fally looked embarrassed and said, in this battle, those cavalry should not obey our command. After all, they are loyal to Paulie's troops. No. Clarence's eyes became cold, and he shook his head slowly, and said in a deep voice, from now on, they only need to, and can only, be loyal to Corsica. Thank you to the book friend a legendary pigeon for the reward and monthly ticket support, and the book friend 110 together with 120 for the monthly ticket support. Thank you very much. Chapter 121. Yes, I'm threatening you. Huh? What's going on? Why are all the British getting off the ship? Oh, they're all carrying knives. What are they doing? In the port of Ajaccio, the workers who were shuttling around the docks soon noticed something was wrong with the Reasonable and started talking about it. A large group of British sailors gathered on the deck, queuing up in an orderly manner to climb down the gangway. Although British sailors were not uncommon on the docks during this period, it was the first time that the workers saw so many sailors appear together. The sailors lined up on the docks, silently watching Captain Morris at the front roaring and giving them the final mobilization. After learning that Sir Pitt was in danger, the sailors became nervous, fearing that they would also be held jointly responsible for this. Do you understand? You bastards. Captain Morris roared loudly, venting all his anxiety and uneasiness on the soldiers in front of him, and shouted, if anything goes wrong with Sir Pitt, all of us will be waiting for the military court. The sailors listened to Captain Morris's roar and couldn't help touching the scimitars and pistols on their waists, knowing that there would be a fierce battle waiting for them. At this time, several dock workers carrying wooden boxes passed by here, and the square formation of hundreds of sailors undoubtedly blocked their way. Hey, British, make way. These cynical dock workers only thought that the British were giving a rally speech, so they didn't care whether they could understand it or not, and shouted to pass through the square formation. Captain Morris's face suddenly turned pale when he saw this, and he drew his saber and walked towards the workers. Huh? What are you going to do? The leading worker saw Captain Morris walking towards him and was about to ask in confusion. However, before he could finish his words, with a pop, Morris's knife had already sunk into his heart. This murder, blatant murder. As the worker's body slowly fell, the other workers stepped back in fear, threw the goods in their hands on the ground, turned around and ran away. They didn't understand why the British suddenly killed him. Even the sailors of the Reasonable looked at Captain Morris in disbelief, watching him take out a handkerchief and wipe the blood on the tip of the knife with disdain. Listen, all of you, there is no need to be soft-hearted to these Corsican monkeys. They are no different from those black ghosts and Indian savages. Captain Morris put the wiped saber back into the sheath, turned around and shouted at the sailors, as long as someone stands in front of you, chop him down. No matter if he is a woman, old man or child, do you hear me? Today I will make Ajaccio a river of blood. At the same time, in the governor's mansion, in Lawrence's study, I heard you were looking for me, Governor Bonaparte. A burly man stood in front of Lawrence with an expressionless face, and saluted Lawrence calmly. Although his tone and actions were impeccable, there was not a trace of respect for Lawrence in them, but a sense of perfunctory everywhere. Lawrence raised his head, and squinted at the man. He was the captain of the cuirassiers, Captain Matic. 2 years ago, Lawrence had dealt with him twice in Bastia and Ajaccio, but the endings of both dealings were not very pleasant. In addition, Captain Matic was a completely poorly affiliated officer, so it was not surprising that he had such an attitude towards Lawrence at this moment. Please sit down, Captain Matic. Lawrence smiled and gestured for him to sit down, saying, there is an enemy in Ajaccio. I need you and your men to temporarily accept the command of Major Trifoli. After hearing this, Captain Matic did not even ask what the enemy was that Lawrence was talking about. He waved his hand and said, I'm sorry, Governor Bonaparte, all the cuirassiers, including me, are directly under General Pauly. This will not change, because he resigns as governor of Corsica. You have no right to mobilize us. Lawrence still had a smile on his face, thinking to himself, Captain Matic has a good political sense. He knows that I can't take action against him as soon as I take office. He probably relies on this to have such a tough attitude. After all, the essential source of power is subordinates, not superiors. Nowadays, almost all the military and political officials in Corsica were promoted by Pauly. If Lawrence took action against them at the beginning of his term, it would inevitably cause a strong backlash. So, Lawrence asked almost calmly, Captain, I want to ask you a question. Corsica and Pauly, which side are you loyal to? Captain Matic shook his head and replied, the two sides are not in opposition. We are loyal to General Pauly and Corsica at the same time. What about the priority? Lawrence asked immediately. Captain Matic was stunned for a moment, thinking that Lawrence was going to use the name of Corsica to threaten him to send troops. So he answered directly and truthfully, I will not hide it in front of Governor Bonaparte. General Pauly has a higher priority. However, Captain Matic did not realize that when he said this, he had already fallen into Lawrence's trap. So that's the case. Lawrence chuckled and nodded. Captain Matic's words had long been expected by him, so he immediately said, does that mean that after General Pauly's death, you can be completely loyal to Corsica? What do you mean? Captain Matic opened his mouth and was stunned for a while before asking Lawrence. Lawrence did not speak, but handed a document from the drawer to Captain Matic. This document was just drafted by Lawrence. It only needed Lawrence's signature to be issued as an administrative order. A correct version was found on the 16-9 book forum. Captain Matic frowned and took the document and glanced at it. After reading the title, he could not help but feel a chill on his back. He looked up and stared at Lawrence in disbelief. The title of the document read, Emergency Order to Execute the Traitor Pasquale Paoli. Lawrence, how dare you? Captain Matic almost jumped up from his chair, slammed his hands on the table, and questioned Lawrence loudly, you despicable usurper. You still want to kill General Paoli? Do you know the consequences of this? In Captain Matic's view, Lawrence's so-called coup was just a farce. He believed that Lawrence had no foundation and confidence to control the entire Corsica, because at this time, General Nathan still had 2,000 troops in the Northern Legion. As long as he marched south, he could easily drive Lawrence out of Ajaccio and support Pauly's restoration. This is why Captain Matic dared to tear his face with Lawrence so hard at this moment. Since the two had already torn their faces, Lawrence stopped talking nonsense and looked directly at Captain Matic and said coldly, "You don't have to consider the consequences for me. You just need to make a choice. Either listen to my command or let Paulie die. You lunatic, damn it." Captain Matic couldn't help wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. His idea just now had an absolute premise, that is, General Paulie must be alive. Once Paulie died, his old subordinates would definitely not remain united, and the consequence of that would basically be that General Nathan would be in power alone. If this happened, Captain Matic would be excluded and liquidated by General Nathan, because he did not belong to the Northern Legion. Captain Matic also understood that, although Lawrence had no reason to attack him, he had every reason to execute Paulie. After all, Paulie announced the treaty with the British in front of so many representatives in the parliament, and the treason that Lawrence had brought against Paulie was absolutely undeniable. "Don't hesitate, Captain." Lawrence clasped his hands together on his abdomen, looked at Captain Matic, and said in a deep voice, "This order only needs my signature to take effect, and I will appoint you as the executioner and let you shoot Paulie yourself. You are threatening me." Captain Matic clenched his fists, his teeth creaked, and pointed at Lawrence and growled, "Yes, I'm threatening you." Lawrence shrugged indifferently and raised the document in his hand in front of Captain Matic. "You." Captain Matic was already furious and trembling all over, but he also knew in his heart that General Paulie must not die at this time, let alone die in his own hands. Thinking of this, Captain Matic took a deep breath, suppressed all his anger, sat back in front of Lawrence, and asked with gritted teeth, "Governor Bonaparte, what happened in Ajaccio?" "Captain, you are a smart man." Lawrence did not answer immediately, looking at Captain Matic with a slight smile on his face, and then held the unsigned document to his chest and tore it into pieces in front of Captain Matic. Thanks to the monthly ticket support of the book French and Nao Fortune Telling. Chapter 122, Burning Reasonable Number, Part 1. British? How did they get into the city? Didn't they say these people can only move around in the port? Hey, they're all holding knives. What are they doing? Citizens stopped on the street, looking at a large group of sailors rushing in from the port, looking at each other in fear and confusion. All of these sailors held their scimitars in their hands, and the sailors equipped with muskets and pistols had loaded ammunition in advance. All of them marched towards the East City district with ferocious looks. "Captain Morris, the road ahead is quite narrow, and there are quite a few Corsicans crowded there, blocking the road." A sailor walking in the front row observed the road conditions ahead, turned back to the middle of the team, and found Captain Morris and said, "Should we find a Corsican who can speak English to disperse them?" Captain Morris glanced at the sailor with a cold face, which made the sailor's back feel cold. Then he pointed at the sailor's sword and said lightly, "Is it so troublesome? What is the knife in your hand for?" "What do you mean?" The sailor shuddered and couldn't help but look back at the bewildered and unarmed citizens. "You bastard. Don't you remember what I just said? If anyone stands in your way, just swing your knife and cut him down." Yes, I will convey your order right away." A Corsican woman in a long skirt looked at a British sailor walking straight towards her blankly and couldn't help asking, "Good afternoon, soldier, what do you want?" However, the sailor didn't understand the Italian she said at all. Even if he understood, the way he responded to her greeting would not change at all. The sailor's scimitar swung a semicircle in the air, and then chopped into the woman's abdomen with almost no hindrance, and the entire blade sank into the woman's lower abdomen. The sailor slowly pulled out the scimitar, and the blade was covered with a mixture of blood and bile, and even stuck with a few pieces of broken intestines, without even looking at the woman struggling and squirming on the ground. The citizens' thinking almost stopped for a moment. They watched the place where the woman fell slowly soaked into a pool of blood, and had no idea why these British sailors who came for a friendly visit would do this. However, the disappearance of the first life only meant that the massacre had just begun. More sailors rushed into the street with knives in hand, raising their blades to slash at the citizens who were fleeing in panic. For a moment, the whole street was almost covered with blood and bile, and the air was filled with the smell of blood and the stench of rotten human organs. Looking at the sailors again, their white uniforms were all stained with the blood of Corsicans, and even the bottoms of their boots were soaked with blood, and every step they took on the road left a bloody footprint. "Is this necessary, uncle?" Little Nelson stared at the tragic scene in front of him, which was like hell on earth, and subconsciously pulled the corner of Captain Morris's clothes and whispered. Due to Nelson's young age, he did not join the massacre, but he still stood beside Captain Morris and witnessed every innocent life died tragically under the sailors' knives. Although when he joined the Royal Naval Academy, little Nelson was mentally prepared to deprive others of their lives. However, the massacre of civilians and the trampling of the weak were obviously not acceptable to the 12-year-old Nelson. Captain Morris glanced at his nephew and said disdainfully, "Nelson, they are a group of barbarians who are excluded from our civilized society." But little Nelson turned his head away and said timidly, "They are also human beings, aren't they?" "Humph." Captain Morris snorted coldly, patted Nelson on the shoulder and said, "You can't say they are human beings just because they have limbs and facial features. Don't monkeys have 2 arms and 2 legs?" Yes, Nelson knew that he couldn't argue with his uncle, so he turned his head completely to the side and tried not to look at the scene in front of him. "Well, not bad. Look, there will be no one blocking our way." Captain Morris led the team on the empty streets, looking at Ajaccio, which was almost like a dead city, and said to the soldiers around him proudly. The news that the British army was slaughtering civilians was quickly spread by the citizens who had just escaped. The citizens who got the news did not dare to stay at all. They all slipped back to their homes in fear and locked their doors tightly. An officer next to Morris looked around. The surroundings were full of densely packed houses, which were very suitable for hiding ambushes. So he said with some concern, "Our progress is indeed not blocked, but if the Corsican army has an ambush, it will be difficult for us to find it." "Ambush?" Captain Morris shook his head contemptuously and said nonchalantly, "The Corsican army only has smoothbore soldiers. If they want to resist us, they can only arrange linear formations on the streets in advance. How can there be an ambush in this case?" After that, Captain Morris added with a mocking look, "Besides, it would be better if they had an ambush. I'm worried about how to get close to them for hand-to-hand combat." "Well, you are right, Captain Morris." Seeing this, the officer had to put aside his worries and complimented Morris casually. The British sailors were still marching in the streets of Ajaccio, surrounded by a quiet residential area. However, Captain Morris himself soon realized that something was wrong. The surroundings were too quiet. The air was filled with a dead silence. The only sound on the street was the sailors' footsteps. His Captain Morris took a breath, and a sense of uneasiness gradually rose in his heart. What is the Corsican army doing? Why haven't they come to meet the enemy yet? A perfect version of the book in 16:9. Bang! Just as Captain Morris was puzzled, a gunshot suddenly broke out in the silence. Captain Morris suddenly raised his head and looked in the direction of the gunshot like a conditioned reflex. He saw that it was the roof of a civilian house, and a gun muzzle extending from the roof was pointed directly at him. And in the next moment, Captain Morris heard a short buzzing sound in his ear. It was the sound of the air vibrating in the air when the bullet passed by his ear. Captain Morris screamed in pain and fell to the ground. The bullet was completely embedded in his thigh, and the wound had begun to bleed continuously. The sailors looked at Morris, who was lying on the ground in a daze. They couldn't understand why Captain Morris' luck was so bad that he was hit by a bullet. However, these sailors had no time to think. At the moment when Captain Morris fell, hundreds of Corsican soldiers rushed out of the houses on both sides of the street that was empty just now. They raised their muskets and fired a round at the British army, then gave up loading and swung their bayonets to fight fiercely with these sailors. On the roofs of the houses on both sides, more than 20 rifles were immediately extended to accurately snipe the sailors below. Captain Morris, who was lying on the ground, looked at the Corsican soldiers around him in disbelief. He never expected that the Corsican army would adopt the most stupid tactics in his eyes. This bunch of idiots. They actually gave up their range advantage to fight hand to hand with us. Captain Morris was lying on the ground, spitting blood, but the corners of his mouth could not help but rise. In his opinion, this battle was completely won by his side. The battle between the British and Corsican soldiers was still going on fiercely. Although the Corsican army had an advantage in the first round of shooting, it was obvious that the experienced sailors had the upper hand after entering the hand-to-hand combat. On the roof of a civilian building not far away, Lawrence and Major Trifle were crouching there, observing the situation on the battlefield. Governor Bonaparte, it's just as I expected. We have no advantage at all after the close combat. Major Trifle frowned as he looked at the battle situation below, and could not help but speak out. Lawrence also nodded in approval, but there was no worry on his face, because he knew that the troop that would decide the outcome of this battle had not yet appeared. Wait. At this moment, Captain Morris, who was lying on the ground, suddenly realized something, and quickly tilted his head to the ground, and listened carefully for a while. Captain Morris? What happened to you? The sailors who were responsible for protecting Morris asked worriedly, when they saw him suddenly like this. Captain Morris slowly raised his head, his face was pale, and he murmured, "It's strange that there is a sound of horse hooves. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels." Chapter 123 Burning Reasonable Number, Part 2. What is this? What's going on? Did you feel it? Could it be? The British sailors who were fighting fiercely also noticed something was wrong, and looked around in panic. They only felt the ground beneath their feet vibrate slightly. In addition to the sound of metal and iron between the soldiers on both sides, they also heard a dull and orderly sound of horse hooves. Captain Morris, who was surrounded and protected by the soldiers, struggled to stand up. There was no trace of blood on his face. It was not known whether it was because of his hands or because he guessed the worst outcome. The sound of horse hooves was getting closer and closer. The sailors could even hear dozens of war horses neighing in unison. The loud neighing made their backs cold. At this moment, even the dullest sailors reacted. This was not a tactical mistake of the Corsican army at all, but a complete ambush. Captain Mosley looked around with his eyes blank. The street they were on was flat. Although it was not wide, the cavalry charged without any hindrance. The Corsican army did not give the British much time to react. 50 fully armed cuirassiers rushed out from the street corner on the road, where the British sailors came. The pure black war horses under their crotches were like a black wave, sweeping towards the sailors. It's the cavalry. Coming from the back. Damn it, those with muskets in their hands. Go to the back and form a defense line. No. We can't get away, it's too late. The British army, who were fighting with the Corsican soldiers in the front, had no time to take care of the rear, and could only watch the cuirassiers charging on horseback. Captain Morris opened his mouth wide, almost unconsciously muttering, "Impossible, this is Paulus cuirassiers. How could they obey the orders of the usurper? This is impossible." Although Captain Morris knew that there was such an elite cavalry unit in the Corsican army, he did not believe that Lawrence could control these cavalry in a short time. Therefore, from the moment the battle began, Captain Morris completely excluded this cuirassiers from his consideration. Listen, aim and fire. Captain Matic took the lead, leading his men to charge at the forefront, and personally drew his pistol to lead his men to shoot. After a burst of dense gunfire, the Corsican soldiers who were fighting the British army head-on in front also understood the situation, and tacitly separated from the British army to avoid being accidentally injured by friendly forces. After a round of shooting, the cavalry drew their sabers, and rushed into the British formation like a tiger into a flock of sheep. And these sailors at sea had no means to counter the cavalry, and could only watch the cavalry constantly attacking their own formation back and forth. Oh my god, the British are doomed to fail. Governor Bonaparte. Major Trifle looked down with a sharp gaze, watching Captain Matic charging into battle in person, and said to Lawrence with admiration, "I didn't expect you to convince Captain Matic to join the battle. My opinion of him has changed a little." But Lawrence did not respond, but continued to observe the changes on the battlefield with a serious expression, especially the performance of Captain Matic. This was also the first time Lawrence saw the combat effectiveness of these well-trained and well-equipped cavalry on the battlefield. It must be said that their performance was better than Lawrence expected. This unit must be in my own hands. As for Captain Matic, Lawrence silently watched Captain Matic on horseback, thinking to himself, He is indeed an experienced cavalry officer, but he can no longer hold the command. The reason why Lawrence took great pains to threaten Captain Matic to send troops today, instead of directly sending someone to replace him, was also due to his own experience and ability. If an officer who is completely unfamiliar with this cavalry is suddenly replaced, it will inevitably have a huge impact on the combat effectiveness of the cuirassiers. However, after Corsica is completely pacified, Lawrence will certainly not allow Captain Matic, an unstable factor, to continue to lead this unit. Damn it. Captain Morris injured the gunshot wound in his leg and tried his best to roll on the ground to avoid the slash of a cavalryman, and then stood up with difficulty with the help of the soldiers guarding him. Captain, it's already too late. The sailor who was supporting Morris almost cried and said, give the order quickly. TSK Captain Morris covered the gunshot wound on his thigh and gritted his teeth to look around the battlefield. This ordinary street was already full of corpses, and most of them were the bodies of his sailors. Even the British sailors who were still resisting had to fight with the Corsican soldiers in front of them, while being wary of the cuirassiers charging back and forth, and even pay attention to the precise shooters sniping on the rooftops. The thin blades in the hands of the sailors could not deal with the threats from these three directions at the same time. Check out the correct version in 16,191 book and 1 forum. Although Captain Morris was extremely unwilling, he also knew that, if he did not retreat, his army would be wiped out, including Captain Morris' own injuries. If they were not treated quickly, they would soon endanger his life. Everyone, listen up. Retreat. Retreat. Evacuate towards the rational. Don't take the main road. Spread out and go through the alleys. Captain Morris's shouting at the top of his lungs immediately made the British sailors in the fight no longer have the will to resist. After shaking off the Corsican soldiers in front of them, they ran into the alleys on both sides without looking back. Captain Morris himself and the frightened little Nelson were also quickly carried away by the sailors, who were protecting them. It seems that this Morris is not that stupid. Major Trefali frowned and watched the sailors on the field fleeing to the alleys around them, and couldn't help saying. Captain Morris specifically asked the soldiers to disperse and escape from the narrow alleys, to prevent the cuirassiers from chasing them. Otherwise, for these cavalrymen, hacking and killing the enemies who were running away with their backs to them would be as easy as breathing. Lawrence nodded in approval, and then told Major Trefali, notify the soldiers to go directly to the port. They can only evacuate to the reasonable. Yes. With the British sailors fleeing, and the Corsican army's pursuit, the street full of corpses returned to peace. The citizens living in this neighborhood opened their doors with fear and carefully went to the street to check the situation. After they learned that the British were massacring in Ajaccio, these citizens almost fled back to their homes in despair, locked their families in the house, and trembled to pray for God's salvation. However, when the citizens walked onto the streets with the feeling of surviving a disaster, looking at the corpses on the ground, they realized who saved them and who was protecting Corsica. The citizens suppressed their grief and began to help the soldiers who stayed behind to clean up the battlefield and clean the bodies of these Corsican warriors. At the same time, in their hearts, compared to Paulie, who was rumored to sell Corsica to the Devil of England, their admiration for the newly appointed Governor Bonaparte has reached a new height. Thanks to a legendary pigeon, 80 kilograms anti-tank mine, and book friend 20210906090037100 for their monthly ticket support. Chapter 124, Burning Reasonable Number, Part 2. Lawrence and Major Trifle arrived at the port of Ajaccio on horseback. The surrounding blocks had been cleared by soldiers, and the workers, boatmen and other personnel on the dock were evacuated. Hundreds of armed soldiers surrounded the dock, where the Reasonable was moored, waiting for battle, and occasionally engaging in sporadic exchanges of fire with the sailors on the ship. However, outside the martial law area, a large number of citizens could still be seen gathered here. After learning that the executioners had been driven away, they also walked out of their homes and followed the pursuing soldiers to the port of Ajaccio. Lieutenant, what's the situation now? Lawrence turned over and dismounted and asked Lieutenant Set, who was in charge of the pursuit. Lieutenant Set pointed to the Reasonable with a solemn expression and said, "Report to the commander. The pursuit went smoothly. We captured at least 200 people, but there were still dozens of British people who escaped back to the ship, including their commander. What's the situation on the Reasonable now? Lawrence's expression did not relax at all, and he frowned and looked at the ship of the Reasonable and asked. Lieutenant Set explained, the number of people inside is unclear, but including the number of people left on the ship, it should not exceed 200. However, you can see that this warship is as easy to defend as a city wall for the British. If they attack it by force, they will probably have to pay a price. Lawrence listened to Lieutenant Set's description while observing the Reasonable. Dozens of sailors with muskets gathered on the deck of the Reasonable, exchanging fire with the soldiers below under the cover of the ship's side. Lieutenant Set was right. This warship was indeed like a city wall. If the Corsican soldiers wanted to enter the ship, they had to forcibly attack from the gangway, like climbing a ladder. Lawrence nodded, basically understood the situation on the scene, and then turned his head to look at the citizens who gathered not far away. For the citizens of Ajaccio, they should never forget April 1st. From the riots in the early morning to the abdication of Governor Pauli at noon, to the massacre of the British in the afternoon, they really experienced too many changes in this short day. But this did not make the citizens tired. When they learned that the British executioners were defeated by Governor Bonaparte's troops, the fear in their hearts immediately turned into sympathy for their dead compatriots and anger at the atrocities of the British army. This is why they gathered here. Major, after understanding the situation, Lawrence ordered Major Trifle next to him, you immediately notify the Navy to sail the 2 line ships of the Navy out of the port for alert. Once the Reasonable tries to raise anchor and sail to escape, open fire directly. Although Lawrence believed that Captain Morris would not take the risk of being sunk and forcefully escape from the port, he still had to make full preparations just in case. Navy, I'm afraid they won't be so obedient. Major Trifle looked at Lawrence hesitantly and said, after all, the Corsican Navy was established from scratch by Pauli himself. Major Trifle was also very worried about whether they would obey Lawrence's orders. No. Lawrence waved his hand without any worry and said in a deep voice, they must also know about the massacre and atrocities committed by the British in Ajaccio. If they dare to play any tricks on such a major issue, I will lead the troops to surround their naval headquarters immediately after I deal with the British. After that, Lawrence added to Major Trifle, by the way, you can quote this sentence of mine to them. Yes, I understand. Seeing that Lawrence said so, Major Trifle also saluted and went to execute the order. Lieutenant Set watched Major Trifle leave, but the solemnity on his face did not diminish. Even though the Reasonable has become a turtle in a jar, it will take some effort to gnaw down this hard bone. Governor, what should we do next? Lieutenant Set looked at Lawrence and pondered for a moment and ordered, use the strong attack as a last resort and send someone to test their willingness to negotiate first. Yes. At the same time, inside the Reasonable, in the captain's cabin, Captain Morris endured the severe pain and watched the military doctor on board roughly remove the bullet from his wound with tweezers and then simply disinfected and bandaged it. The officers on the ship gathered around Morris, all looking at Captain Morris with worry, waiting for his next order. At this moment, a sailor on the upper deck rushed in a panic and excitement, saluted the officers, and reported, Sir, the Corsicans said they want to negotiate with us. Negotiate? The officers present heard the news, and looked at each other, and saw a hint of excitement in their eyes. They had just recovered from the charge of the cuirassiers, and had long lost the will to resist. Now hearing that they could negotiate with the Corsicans, it was inevitable that they were excited. Captain Morris's expression did not change at all. He asked the sailor in a weak voice, what did the Corsicans ask for? This. The sailor was stunned for a moment and said, they didn't say it clearly, but just asked us all to get off the ship, and said they would make a fair judgment on us. Captain Morris. The officers immediately looked at Morris eagerly. In their opinion, as an officer, they could keep their lives even after being captured, and they could also wait for the Royal Navy to redeem them. There was no need to stay on the ship and fight the Corsicans to the end. Humph. Captain Morris looked around at the officers and snorted disdainfully, you bunch of idiots. Our biggest bargaining chip now is this Reasonable. Once we get off the ship, won't we be at the mercy of the Corsicans? What do you think? An officer frowned and asked Captain Morris. Captain Morris said without denying it, the Corsicans are definitely coveting this warship. We will guard it and fight them to the end. Anyway, they dare not act rashly. You, soldier, tell the Corsicans that we refuse to negotiate. As soon as this was said, the officers, including the sailor who delivered the message, could not help but show disappointment on their faces and glanced at Captain Morris with some resentment. The British refused to negotiate. Lawrence was not surprised. After receiving the news from Lieutenant Set, it would be easy to deal with if the British accepted the conditions. Even if they did not accept it, Lawrence had other ways. Ahem. Governor Bonaparte. Lieutenant Set said with a somewhat ugly face. Just now some people heard the news that the British refused to negotiate. They are very angry now and hope that we will take tough measures against the British. Lawrence nodded calmly after hearing this. The price of playing with populism is that it is easy to be kidnapped by public opinion. Lawrence himself is also very clear about this. However, fortunately, Lawrence's ideas this time coincided with those of the people. Lieutenant, where is the patrol team now? Lawrence suddenly asked. Patrol team? They are maintaining order and calming the people outside. Lieutenant Set replied. Send someone to call Grosso from the patrol team to see me. Got it. Just a moment later, Grosso came to Lawrence and asked in some confusion, what happened? I know nothing about the military. Lawrence shook his head, pointed at the Reasonable and asked, how much do you know about this kind of ship? Grosso glanced at the Reasonable, shrugged and said, it's a 3-line ship of the British Royal Navy. It has the most excellent shipbuilding technology and the best materials. The keel is definitely made of top quality oak that is more than 300 years old. I know this, even if I haven't been on that ship. All ships of the Royal Navy are like this. After explaining, Grosso joked, but don't think about seizing this ship for your own use, otherwise the Royal Navy will send a fleet to ask you to take it back. No. Lawrence shook his head firmly and said slowly, in my eyes, this warship already belongs to Corsica, but it still needs to go through a small step. Huh? What step? Grosso was stunned and asked puzzled. Burn it. Thanks to book friend Deheo for his monthly ticket support. Chapter 125. Let them atone with fire. His Captain Morris took a deep breath. The gunshot wound on his leg was still aching, and according to the military doctor, if he continued to be trapped in this simple environment, his wound would only get worse. Captain Morris, if you stay on the ship for too long, your injury will be difficult to treat. Beside Morris, a group of officers were still surrounding him, persuading Captain Morris to surrender. Humph, don't I know how serious my injuries are? Captain Morris glanced at everyone with undisguised disgust, spat a mouthful of blood on the ground and said, don't you just want to persuade me to abandon the ship and surrender? I tell you, give up this idea as soon as possible. The officers looked at each other after their purpose was exposed, but did not give up, and still insisted, Captain, we can't hold on for long. The Corsicans can even trap us here and starve us to death. What do you know? Captain Morris pointed at the man who spoke angrily and said, the Corsicans are definitely coveting this battleship. As long as we hold on to the Reasonable, they will definitely make concessions, you idiot. If it were any other time, after being insulted by Captain Morris like this, the officer would definitely lower his head and remain silent. But in such a desperate situation, the officer no longer had any fear of Captain Morris and directly fought back. But if you push the Corsicans into a corner and make them attack directly, we here, including you, may not even be able to save our lives. You cowardly bastard. Captain Morris could no longer suppress his anger, and he endured the pain, and stood up to find his sword, pointing the tip of the sword at the officer and cursed, if you are afraid of death, I will send you to see God. The officer also went all out, and regardless of everyone's obstruction, he drew his sword, and directly pushed away Morris's sword tip, scolding, Captain Morris, you have no right to deprive me of my life directly. I'm going to exercise my right to self-defense. You bastard. Come on. Captain Morris shouted angrily, not to be outdone. At this tense moment, another sailor staggered in. As soon as he entered the door, the sailor shouted loudly, before he had time to figure out the situation in the cabin, report, Captain Morris. The Reasonable is on fire. The Corsicans set the fire. On fire? Captain Morris looked at the sailor in disbelief, put his sword aside absent-mindedly, and couldn't stop repeating in a low voice, "Impossible, impossible, don't they want this battleship anymore? Impossible." The other officers also cast their shocked eyes at Morris. Some of them just supported Captain Morris' plan to wait for the Corsicans to compromise, but now, the Corsicans were undoubtedly impatient. Wait. Captain Morris suddenly realized something, and shouted at the sailor, "How is the fire? This can't be a big fire. This is a conspiracy of the Corsicans." However, before the sailor could reply, the officer who had just confronted Morris rushed up, and put the knife on Captain Morris' neck, shouting in despair, "Enough. Morris. At this time, you are still talking about conspiracy. Do you want all of us to die? You." Captain Morris felt a piercing coldness coming from the cold blade on his neck, and when he turned his head to look at the officers present for help, they all avoided Captain Morris's gaze. There is no doubt that in the face of this blazing fire, no one supported Captain Morris' plan anymore. That's it. Burn them to death. Burn more vigorously. Let the flames purify these demons. Damn it. I want to go up and pour 2 buckets of oil myself. The citizens gathered around the dock waved their arms in anger, watching the small flame on the Reasonable gradually spread, forming a firestorm that swept half of the ship. Under the manic sea breeze, the flame soared higher and higher, even directly spreading to the sails of the Reasonable, and in the blink of an eye, the huge canvases like clouds were also covered in flames. The heartbeats of the citizens accelerated sharply. Such a visual impact was something they had never experienced in decades. A British Royal Navy warship flying the St. George flag was in the waters of Corsica, paying the price for their atrocities, and being purified by fire for their sins. For many Corsicans, they vowed to regard witnessing this scene as the most wonderful experience in their lives, and in the future they would never tire of telling their children and grandchildren the story of Governor Bonaparte burning the British ship. Isn't this fire a bit too much? Lawrence frowned as he looked at the fiercely burning Reasonable, and couldn't help asking Grosso, "Don't worry, I know my limits." Grosso waved his hand confidently and said, "Don't think that this ship is made of wood. As long as the internal fire is not on fire, it will take a long time for the external flames to damage the main structure of the ship. As long as there is no problem with the main structure, it will be much easier to repair." Lawrence nodded silently after hearing this. As a mechanical engineer in his previous life, he knew that, although wood is flammable, it can effectively block flames after being completely burned and carbonized. Therefore, although the entire ship of Reasonable seemed to be shrouded in flames, it would not suffer fatal damage in a short time. In addition, the sailors on the ship were also desperately trying to put out the fire, which made Lawrence feel much more at ease. After all, in Lawrence's eyes, this high-quality line battleship had been included in his Corsica property. Although the British would definitely not turn a blind eye to this, Lawrence, who had France behind him, and William Pitt as a hostage, was not worried about the British revenge. "By the way, your trick is really mean." A correct version in the 16-9 book forum. Grosso looked at the burning rational, and couldn't help shaking his head and said, "Setting a fire to force those sailors to surrender. I guess the people above will be scared to death." Lawrence's pupils reflected the orange flames, and then shook his head slightly and said, "This fire is not just for the people above." "Huh? What do you mean?" Grosso was puzzled for a moment, then he turned his head and looked behind him with sudden realization, looking at the excited and cheering citizens behind him. Undoubtedly, this is the most effective way to ignite the emotions of the people. But having said that, Grosso suddenly remembered something, laughed and said, "Do you know what I remembered? When I was a kid in my hometown, I did this to drive the mice out of the holes in my house." Ha ha ha. Lawrence also chuckled with Grosso and said, "But the way I catch mice is probably different from yours." "Oh, why is it different?" Grosso asked interestedly. Lawrence's eyes were fixed on the upper deck of the Reasonable. He vaguely saw several officers coming out of the captain's cabin, so he restrained his smile and said in a cold voice, "Not only will I catch these rats with fire, I will also use fire to make these rats atone for their sins." This. Grosso was stunned, and after reacting, he hurriedly reminded in a low voice, "Boy, they are British. You want to burn them to death." Lawrence just shook his head indifferently and said, "I only know that they are the sinners who massacred the Corsicans." Thanks to Shinio Fortune Telling, Bookfriend 202206022137122229. Quote, Hiyuxi, Little Zhang Hanlin, Cans, Huo Kang. Thanks to the above book friends for their monthly ticket support. Some things happened in reality today. I'm sorry for the late update. There is still one chapter later, but it should be posted at noon. I'm very sorry ORZ. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.